Welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio, a project of the Center for a Stateless Society. I am your host, Zachary Woodman. Today, my guest is Matthew McManus. Matt McManus is an incoming assistant professor of political theory at Spelman College. He's the author of The Political Right and Equality, as well as The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, a book which we will be discussing today. McManus sees himself as engaging in a project of retrieval of a forgotten tradition of thought within the liberal tradition which advocates for socialist ends. Now, this is a project with which I have some affinity as someone who considers myself a liberal anarchist, but I have deep disagreements with the way he explains the differences between liberal socialists and other liberals, as well as especially the institutional form that he thinks liberal socialism should take in the form of a statist social democracy. You will see us get into those disagreements towards the end of this discussion, but for now, without further ado, here's my discussion with Matt McManus. Hello, welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio, a project of the Center for a Stateless Society. I am Zachary Woodman, your host. Joining us today is Matthew McManus. How are you today, Matt?
I am doing pretty well. It's the middle of the summer. It's a beautiful day. What's there to complain about, right?
Yeah. So we invited you on the show because you wrote a very interesting recent book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, where you are engaging in what you call a project of retrieval of this tradition of liberal socialism that to many sounds paradoxical, and you articulate in a way I think many in our audience would disagree with, but I nonetheless found your book really interesting and engaging to read.
Thank you.
So I guess let's start with the basic question: what is liberalism to you?
So I think that Alan Ryan is correct that it's better to talk about liberalisms, plural, rather than liberalism, singular, right? And what Professor Ryan means by that is liberalism can be understood as a broad family of different views, all of which share certain kind of characteristics with one another, just like a family, right? But also just like a family, there are some members that look and act quite different from one another. And there's some members of your family that you might very well think, how the hell are we related, right? So in terms of what unites all these together, I would characterize liberalism as an Enlightenment philosophy that obviously has antecedents, that's broadly speaking committed to the principles of liberty for all and equality for all. And certainly in the continental European tradition, many would include solidarity or fraternity for all in there as well. Now, these principles are very abstract and have been understood as such by various liberal philosophers, right? But I would argue that any liberal philosopher would generally be committed to them. What that means, or what it means to instantiate a commitment to liberty, equality, and potentially fraternity for all, obviously is where a lot of the meat and action is within liberal political thought.
Good. So the three notions that we picked up on there was a commitment to equality for all, understood variously, commitment to liberty for all, understood variously. And then the third condition was this commitment to like solidarity or fraternity or something like that. But it seems like you think not all liberals are committed to that. So could you elaborate on that more controversial third condition a little more and the disagreements about it?
Well, almost all liberals are committed in some way, shape, or form to equality of some sort, right? So I think that principle is relatively uncontroversial, right? You can read a very right-wing liberal like Ludwig von Mises in his book Liberalism, and he'll insist that by nature people are fundamentally unequal, even between brothers. There are inequalities that appear. But people should be still entitled, nonetheless, to equality before the law, right? Or equal rights to pursue their self-interest and to pursue their betterment under capitalist conditions, right? So that's quite a right-wing understanding of equality within the liberal tradition. By contrast, you have left-wing liberals like Martha Nussbaum, Mary Wollstonecraft, John Rawls, who understand a commitment to liberty in a much more robust sense, right? Similarly, I don't think that anybody would question that liberals are committed to liberty or freedom for all or for most in some substantial way, right? In fact, Maurice Cranston gave a famous definition of liberalism where he said, a liberal is a man or woman who is committed to liberty, just wholesale, right? Or, think about what people used to say in the United States, right? Give me liberty or give me death, or live free or die, that kind of thing. The Republican tradition of a commitment to solidarity or fraternity is a little bit less acknowledged within the Anglosphere, who tends to associate that with a kind of nasty French revolutionary quality. right? But I would dispute that that makes it any less of a core liberal commitment. Since, of course, if you were to go to France or Germany, indeed most of the countries that call themselves liberal, there would always be this commitment to a kind of Republican, egalitarian, solidaristic ethos.
Yeah, I like this way of like thinking about liberalisms as sharing these qualities. I would articulate it maybe a little differently. I would follow, former guest on this show, uh, Jason Lee Bias, who wrote this good piece, liberalism or radical liberalism, the soul of libertarianism, where he articulated liberalism as like this belief of a natural harmony of real interests between all people. Right. And that's like the positive side. And I would also emphasize a negative, like maybe Jason does a little bit, but a negative side of like this sobering fear of the capacity for humans to become really sadistic and cruel. People like Judith Sklar, Isaiah Berlin, or Richard Rorty do that.
Sure.
And yeah, I'm sympathetic to this desire to like recast an understanding of like social solidarity in a way, because like the influence of thinkers like that on me. Even if I disagree with like the way someone like Rorty would have articulated it.
Sure, absolutely. And I mean, the one that you described before, a commitment to this idea that human beings can harm one another and we should ameliorate that to the extent possible, is very much an important feature of what's sometimes called the liberalism of fear, following
exactly.
Judith Sklar.
Yeah.
And, you can trace those roots back to people like Thomas Hobbes, right? Certainly you can find intimations of it in people like Isaiah Berlin, who you mentioned, the idea being that we should cast the aspirations of society a little bit lower, because there's this expectation that when we aim too high, that's where we can give into fundamentalist and authoritarian kinds of urges and inclinations. So again, I would say that is very much a emblematic and indeed important member of the liberal family.
Yeah.
The liberalism of fear.
So we can get more into like that, what the aspirations of liberalism should be in a minute, because that's a tension even among liberal socialists, as you talk about.
Oh, yes.
But let's move on to the other half of the liberal socialism thing, which is what socialism is. And this one might be more controversial to some people.
Sure. Well, the canonical understanding of socialism, going all the way back to people like the Owenites, is social ownership of the means of production, right? Now, again, in the Anglosphere, certainly since the Cold War, that's invariably been understood as state ownership of the means of production. And that's because the experience that most people have in the Anglosphere with the socialist tradition, at least in the United States especially, is by and large with the Soviet Union, Maoist China, right? These kind of very statist approaches to socialism. And indeed, those are forms of socialism, that I think are wicked and unjust, but we can put a pin in that for right now. But social ownership of the means of production has also been understood in very different ways by various different socialist theorists, and certainly by socialist practitioners. And one of the goals of my book is in some senses to reintroduce the socialist tradition to the Anglosphere by pointing out it is just as diverse, eclectic, and indeed in many ways rich a tradition as the tradition of liberalism, or for that matter, conservatism and the political right. So just to give a couple of examples from the book, John Stuart Mill, right, was very much a kind of anti-statist socialist. He characterized himself as falling under the general designation of socialism, a socialist in his book, or in his biography. But he said, look, the kind of socialism we should aim for is worker control of the means of production, with something that looks quite like a generous welfare state, right? And if, the workers control the means of production, then in effect, society owns the means of production rather than the capitalists, right? And various kinds of market socialists, down to the present day, people like Romer, for example, have articulated a very kind of similar approach to socialism. Nordic socialism, or the Scandinavian variant of socialism, as it's sometimes called, endorses a kind of pluralistic approach to ownership. This is a point made by Pelle Dragstedt in his recent book, Nordic Socialism, where he says, look, we appreciate that sometimes state ownership or state nationalizations can be important, but we also endorse things like worker cooperatives, small-scale business, etc. And this is in line with the pragmatic experimentalist approach to socialism that you saw undertaken in many of the Nordic states, right? So it's a very vast, complicated tradition. And much like with liberalism, there are some variants of socialism that I find extremely appealing, even intuitive. And then there are others that I think are better off relegated to the ash heap of history.
Yeah, I definitely think, there needs to be more reckoning with especially the early pre-Marxist socialist tradition, which identified it with more decentralized, non-state-owned ways of that workers can share in workplace democracy and own the means of production in various ways. That's a project very close to what we here at the center do, of revitalizing interest in, some individualist anarchist thinkers who call themselves socialists, like Benjamin Tucker, even earlier Thomas Hodgkins, who do that. So I can definitely get on board with that. So in the book, you also mentioned that there's this, I had a question about this commitment. You point out how like socialists share with liberals, maybe a bit more than some liberals, this commitment to like material egalitarianism, as well as, this notion of a commitment to like solidarity and cooperation. But you also say that socialists are convinced that we can use like conscious human agency to improve society. And I had this concern that it's unclear to me exactly what that means in practice. At times in the socialist tradition, I worry that like veers into like what Hayek critiqued as like the rationalist constructivism stuff, or Adam Smith would have like criticized some socialists as like men of system in a lot of ways. Or it could, if it's not that, it seems like it could be understood as this very banal thing that pretty much everyone agrees with, that political action can change the world. So I imagine there's a third thing that you think it means that is neither like kind of trivially true like that, or problematic like what Hayek has in mind. So how would you articulate that third option?
Well, I tend to like to approach these things from a very nominalistic perspective and say that it really depends on the author of tradition that we're talking about, right? Certainly there are strands of socialist thinking that drank too deeply of certain kinds of perfectionist, even utopian waters, right? And that includes, ironically, plenty within the Marxist tradition, given that Marx, and that's ironic given that Marx himself was vehemently anti-utopian, right? Just give one example. Leon Trotsky, right, who's an important socialist thinker in addition to being an important historical figure, once projected that the soul of man under socialism would rise to new heights. Everyone would become, a Marx, an Aristotle, a Goethe, and beyond that, further heights would reveal themselves. But of course, it would require a radical transformation of the world as it is. And there, I think that the classical Hayekian critique has an awful lot of bite to it, right? These kinds of utopian aspirations to reinvent the soul of all human beings are just never really going to fly, right? On the other hand, there are plenty of socialists who very much align themselves with the kind of intuitions that underpin the liberalism of fear, for example, right? George Orwell, for example, or Marx himself, were very cognizant of the fact that one of the best arguments for socialism was precisely that inequalities in economic power very readily translate themselves to inequalities of political power. And since power corrupts and absolute power corrupts, absolutely, if we're going to be wary of concentrations of power in the political sphere, we should absolutely be equally wary of concentrations of power in the economic sphere, right? And these forms of socialism are notably not prone to these kinds of rationalist bouts of utopianism, right, or perfectionism. If anything, the argument is that we need socialism in order to put a check on the dangers that can be caused, can result from unbridled acquisitiveness and the exploitation of man by man. And just to kind of add one further addendum, I think that personally, this distinction that Hayek makes between a kind of rationalistic approach to the world that he associates with the continental tradition and a more empirical approach to the world that one sees in the Anglosphere is extremely overstated, right? I don't really think that it sustains itself if you look at history. Just to give one example, right? If you look at the American founding fathers, who Hayek admired quite a bit, right? They were really revolutionaries twice over, right? First off, they overthrew the existing government. Then they replaced the first American Constitution that was much more predicated on what had existed before, the Articles of Confederation, with an entirely new constitution written from scratch that also had a lot of rationalistic features to it. Just to give one example, if you were to go to the United Kingdom, the size of, ridings was extremely arbitrarily set, right? You could have ridings where 10 voters could elect a member of parliament, or hundreds of thousands of voters could elect a member of parliament. And, the American founding fathers quite wisely said, no, we're going to try to make sure that congressional districts are more or less the same size, right? Not completely, but more or less. And that looks a lot like a kind of rationalistic impulse derived from this desire to replace an older constitutional order with a new constitutional order that's going to be much more efficient and better organized, right? So I just don't really think that it is a distinction that's sustainable in historical practice, even though it's a very generative theoretical distinction that obviously gained a lot of traction in the Cold War.
Yeah, I have questions about the way he articulated it, and I think he also got started feeling that way later. Like you mentioned,
Yeah,
connecting
totally.
this like rationalism to utopianism. Like, there's a small. I believe it's pretty early in Law, Legislation, and Liberty, where Hayek's like talking about how classical liberals need to dare to be utopian more. And he might have like thought something like you can be like more utopian in your normative aspirations without being, epistemically hubristic, like some of the socialist thinkers he was so critical of.
I
Um,
absolutely agree. And I mean, critics and proponents of Hayek, like Sciabara, right, have pointed this out,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
That
yeah. That's exactly what I had in mind. Yeah,
exactly right. That Hayek rightly, I think, cautions against an excess of utopian energy and an excess of radical experimentalism. I don't think change for its own sake is a good thing. Change has to have beneficial outcomes. But plenty of people pointed out that, especially in law, legislation, and liberty, it's not like Hayek was opposed to proposing some radical changes of his own to the structure of democracy, how elected officials operate, all that kind of thing, right?
yeah. For better and for worse, like I think
Totally. Yeah.
he would have had like some good criticisms of the way like the American founders and some of his contemporary, classical liberal scholars like Buchanan, were thought you could do
Yeah.
like constitutional design from the armchair in a certain way. Um, and I think those criticisms might have had some bite, given the extent to which the American constitutional order fell apart in recent years, especially. But yeah, so moving
I
on.
would even say it fell apart a lot earlier than that, right?
Oh
I
yeah, I
mean,
would agree.
this is a point that Aziz Rana makes in The Constitutional Bind, his new gigantic book for University of Chicago Press. He's like, look, by any metric, the U.S. Constitution was a failure, at least in its early formulation, because, it lasted for about 70 years, chugging along with crisis after crisis. And then there was a big, gigantic civil war. And then they had to, as the terminology now goes, enact a second founding to radically change things and essentially reconstruct itself from scratch, right? So, again, I think that this distinction between revolutionary rationalism and good old Anglo-American pragmatism and
Mhm.
empiricism is just very, very overstated.
Yeah, yeah. I always found it problematic that he identified it with Anglo-American stuff because some of the biggest defenders of a sort of radically decentralist, like Hayekian order in the
Yeah,
19th century were French, like Bastiat and Molinari, right?
very good
So,
point. Yeah.
but anyway, moving or Proudhon for that matter, to be honest.
Yep.
Anyway, moving on to we've discussed liberals and we've discussed socialism. Now let's discuss their marriage, liberal socialism. What do you think
Sure.
are the features of the liberal socialist tradition?
Well, I think that the liberal socialism is broadly speaking defined by a commitment to three principles. And again, my book is a reconstruction, so I don't offer my own defense of those principles, although stay tuned because I have a book proposal out about this now. But I argue that all liberal socialists are committed to, and I'll move from most abstract to least abstract. First off, what I call normative individualism and methodological collectivism. And what methodological collectivism means is that all liberal socialists appreciate what Aristotle appreciated, which is that human beings are social animals that are flourishing, can only be secured in a social setting, right? But they're normative individualists in the sense that they think that what matters from a normative standpoint is the well-being of actually existing concrete individuals and potentially future generations. Now, who counts as an individual is something that liberal socialists, especially now, debate, right? For instance, there are some who would argue non-human animals get included within the kind of calculuses or moral calculus that we need to make, right? But the argument is essentially, look, actually existing individuals are what's important, not abstract entities like the nation, civilization, the Volk, right? All these kinds of abstractions that people so readily are willing to kill for. And I tend to think that that's a pretty attractive fusion of principles, although, again, all liberal socialists understand the combination in a somewhat different way. The second principle that all liberal socialists are committed to, I submit, and this is drawn from the great Canadian political theorist C.B. Macpherson, is a developmental rather than acquisitive ethic. Basically, liberal socialists say, look, definitely there's some truth to the good old Hobbesian Benthamite argument that human beings are competitive and they like to acquire a lot of stuff, right? I like stuff. I'm sure you like stuff also. But we're more complicated than that. And liberal socialists would argue that actually, more than just having a lot of stuff, human beings benefit from and flourish when our fundamental human powers are developed. Just to give two examples, right? John Stuart Mill gave his famous metaphor of human beings being like a living tree, right? That needed to be allowed to grow and extend itself to its natural extent, right, without kind of inhibitions, and to be empowered or nurtured to do so. Or, even more overtly, John Rawls in Theory of Justice dedicates the last third of his book to an espousal of things like the Aristotelian principle, right? The idea that, human beings like to exercise their capacities, and the more refined those capacities, the more they enjoy exercising them, which is why we prefer to learn to play the violin to counting blades of grass on a field, et cetera, right? So this commitment to a developmental rather than acquisitive ethic is very central to liberal socialism. And then the last principle, and the one that really is probably the most straightforward for a lot of people, is liberal socialists are committed to achieving economic democracy within a liberal political system, committed, of course, to liberal rights, indeed fiercely committed to liberal rights, with the exception of a right to private ownership of the means of production, right? Now, here's where some of the interesting questions comes in, because every liberal socialist, certainly that I've talked about, is committed to the idea that people should own or are entitled to own personal property, right? Nobody wants the state coming in, taking your home, taking your car, taking your PS5 or whatever. And plenty of liberal socialists are also comfortable with the idea of private businesses, worker cooperatives of a certain scale, et cetera. The argument is that the commanding heights of the economy should be owned socially. Although, again, what that means, whether that should be done through worker co-ops, kind of market socialism, or a mixed system with markets and nationalizations, that's where there's a lot of interesting debates that take place.
So we can move on to like some questions that I have about this distinction or this way of specifying liberal socialism, and some objections that one might raise later. But first, I want to note, like, a lot of the people you talk to from like the libertarian world seem to like object that liberal socialism is an oxymoron in some way, because they have Hayekian concerns about identifying socialism with central planning. I don't want to dwell on those questions too much right now, because I'm deeply into the sort of project of retrieval of various parts of the liberal tradition that have been neglected. For myself and some of my fellow scholars here at C4SS, it's more articulated as liberal anarchism. So at a very high level of abstraction, I think we can all agree liberal socialism isn't really a oxymoron, even if at a lower level of institutional abstraction we would disagree about how it can be, the tensions between socialist ideals and liberal ideals.
Sure. If I could just intervene there. I get this a lot, right? I mean, I even point out in the introduction of the book that was one of the first things that people said to me. The funny story I relay about that is I managed to unite the neoliberals and the tanky Marxists for a few seconds, for a brief moment, right? There was unity because they all said, this is oxymoronic, right? And you don't normally see those types agree about anything. But, what I point out is, look, from a purely descriptive and historical level, I think it's very obvious that liberal socialism is not an oxymoron, because there were people who were liberal socialists, right? So if something exists, it exists, right? You can't just decide to conceptualize it away, right? John Stuart Mill, Rawls, Chantal Mouffe, etc., form a tradition of people who characterize themselves as liberal socialists, who develop certain core themes. And I think that question is settled, if I could be a little arrogant there, right? I think I provide enough textual evidence to support that. The more important and more interesting question then, is this oxymoronic, is this an attractive ideal, right? Can this work outside of the realm of theory? Which Hayek also pointed out, right? Where he said, at this point, liberal socialism is nothing more than a theoretical ideal. It can't actually instantiate itself practically. Well, there we can actually have a much more interesting discussion about, is this an attractive ideal to aspire to? Could it actually be implemented successfully in practice? What kind of challenges would be imposed? And there, I think that there are very serious problems with the liberal socialist tradition, certainly as I describe it in my book, right? Again, it's not hagiography, right? But I think that sort of normative and hypothetical questions is a lot more interesting to me, certainly now, than the descriptive question of does liberal socialism exist as a theoretical tradition, when a lot of theorists said, I espouse liberal socialism, here's what it is.
Yeah, so let's start going through some of the things you talk about in like the history of the liberal socialist tradition. Let's start with the more, as you do in the book, the more like pre-socialist or proto-socialist liberals. So let's start with Hobbes.
Sure.
I've long had like deep concerns about the way people like position Hobbes as a liberal thinker, because of, the way he defends a very authoritarian Leviathan state. He seems to think there's only like one right to defense, that you entirely secede you entirely give up once you enter into the social contract. And then he like says things like that Leviathan state can't even injure people. And that seems to me like kind of out of step with like the liberal concern for state power and stuff. But you present like a way that like in a way better than most people who write about Hobbes I've read. A way that he really did help launch the sort of Enlightenment project of liberalism and in certain ways. So can you flesh out that kind of defense of the sort of concerns I have about counting Hobbes as a liberal?
Sure. Well, I mean, I would agree with you that I don't think Hobbes is a liberal. Certainly, if we're talking about liberal political commitments, which I think are very important, right? Since liberalism is a political ideology. But at a metaphysical and philosophical level, there's no denying that Hobbes was an enormous influence on liberalism and invented or developed a lot of the ingredients that are later going to go on to influence or are going to be picked up by much more obvious liberal thinkers like for instance, Locke, for example, or Kant. So what I argue in the book is that following Charles Taylor, if you go back to antiquity, a lot of the ways that people understood society and individuality were very contrary to the way that liberals understood society and individuality. Charles Taylor in Modern Social Imaginaries points out that if you were to go ask Aristotle, Aristotle would emphatically deny that all people should be regarded as free and equal citizens, right? If anything, Aristotle would defend the idea that there are certain people who are just naturally fit for slavery in the politics. And this is because, according to Taylor, and I like this term a lot, the kind of social ideal that antiquarian thinkers were beholden to was one defined by what he calls hierarchical complementarity, right? This idea that fundamentally society is a pyramid, right? There are the people at the bottom, and then there are people at the top. And the more sophisticated defenders of hierarchical complementarity all understood that the people at the bottom need the people, or the people at the top need the people at the bottom, right? You need somebody who's going to clean the streets, clean the toilets, grow the food, etc. But the different ranks of the pyramid are in no sense equal in terms of dignity or political agency, rights, etc. Right? I mean, if you're a slave, you have no rights whatsoever. And a lot of these notions continued into the medieval ages, even though Christian and Stoic thinkers began to challenge them. A good example of this is in Thomistic thought. You see this metaphor often invoked of the great chain of being that conservative thinkers like Burke, for example, still will appeal to. This idea that cosmologically nature is a hierarchy, with God at the top and then angels, and then we fall somewhere in the middle, and then there are animals, and then there are demons. And similarly, society is a hierarchy with the king as God's representative, even granted divine rights to rule. And then, you have the lords, the knights, and then the peasants at the very bottom, right? You still see figures like Robert Filmer defending a patriarchal view of the understanding of this as late as the 17th century against figures like John Locke, who wrote his first treatise of government as a rebuttal of Filmer. So that brings me to Hobbes, right? What Hobbes does that's really extraordinarily innovative is really deny an enormous part of this antiquarian worldview in a way that was so powerful and so convincing and so scientific, and I put that in quotation marks, right? That it really put a lot of them on the defensive. So Hobbes insists, in fact, no, all human beings are fundamentally free and equal in the state of nature. And he thinks that this is just something that no scientifically minded person can deny. Quite an interesting argument, actually, because you still don't see a lot of liberals argue in this way. But he says, look, sure, there are differences in strength between all human beings. Sure, some people are a little smarter than other human beings, but nothing that is of any kind of scientific interest, right? They're just rounding errors in terms of the significance this has in terms of life outcomes. And of course, his famous argument is that all human beings are so fundamentally equal that even the strongest and smartest person can be killed by the weakest and dumbest. All they have to do is wait for that person to fall asleep, right? And of course, Hobbes will go on to argue that this kind of radical equality and freedom in the state of nature is problematic. So we need to establish civil society in order to provide ourselves with protection from one another. But what's also innovative about Hobbes is precisely this very materialist or proto-materialist idea that the state is not what Aristotle described it as, right? This kind of natural space which human beings inhabit with hierarchies that are similarly natural and self-organizing, right? For Hobbes, the state is eminently an artificial, mortal creation. The hierarchies that are established by human beings are done so by conscious choice, ideally, right? We're beholden to them because we've contracted into them. But, of course, what has been made by man can be unmade by man, and Hobbes was also very sensitive to that as well. And I'd push back a little bit on your reading of him as a kind of radical authoritarian. So the University of Toronto's David Deisenhouse has written some very some seminal papers really on what he calls Hobbist and Hobbesian understandings of Hobbes. And he says the kind of Hobbist understanding of Hobbes is exactly as a kind of strict authoritarian figure. But a more Hobbesian understanding of Hobbes recognizes that, for instance, he insists that people always retain a right to life, for example. The state can never take that away from you. Because, of course, you contracted into obedience to the state in order for the state to preserve your life. This means if the state ever threatens your existence, then essentially we revert back to the contractual situation of the state of nature, right, where you're allowed to do whatever it is you feel entitled, compelled to do in order to protect yourself, right? And some innovative thinkers have drawn on these Hobbesian themes to argue, for instance, that no state could legitimately conscript you, or no state could legitimately execute you, which are both arguments I find very attractive, and certainly I think most liberals would find them quite attractive.
That point about Hobbes believing you have a right to life, and if the state threatens your existence, is a perfect segue to Locke, who also has a social contract theory that you discuss. Everyone pretty much agrees that that's might be one of the earliest statements of liberalism.
Yes.
But what do you think are the most important contributions of Locke then to the liberal tradition, especially as the liberal socialist tradition would evolve?
Well, I think Locke is a very rich and very complicated thinker, and I'm not always sure that his thinking is as consistent as someone like Hobbes is, for example. But I also think in some ways that's because Locke is a much more original and daring thinker in some respects. So if his thought doesn't always hang together, or fit together, I guess a better way to put it, as well as Hobbes's does, that's in part because there's just a lot of original ideas that are floating around. To give one underappreciated contribution I think he makes to the liberal traditions, his theory of selfhood and knowledge has often, I think, been underestimated in terms of how it frames the liberal worldview. To invoke Derek Parfit, right, where one of Locke's major original contributions to our understanding of selfhood is he rejects the soul, body, and mind/brain theory of selfhood and insists that it's actually our memories that make up who we are, right? What connects you to the baby that you once were, even though all the cells in your body are more or less completely different, with the exception of a couple of reproductive cells and a few others, is the fact that you share memories of when you were a child, or you have memories of when you were a child that kind of connect you to that point then. And of course, what this means is that really who we are is our experiences, right? The kind of things that we've gone through over the course of our life. That's what makes us who we are. And I think that that is something that's distinctly liberal about that understanding of selfhood, right? That it's experiences and the quality of those experiences that define who you are, more so than ordination by God or naturalistic qualities like sex or gender or anything like that, right? So that's an important contribution that I think he makes. The more familiar contributions that he makes are, of course, his famous defense of this idea that in the state of nature, all people are free and equal and possess natural rights given to them by God, right? Or nature. And there's some debate about that, right? But, particularly the Lockean holy trinity of rights to life, liberty, and property are astoundingly influential. And almost all liberals going forward are going to be influenced by this idea of natural rights in some way, shape, or form. Even those who are negatively influenced by it, like let's say Jeremy Bentham, nonetheless feel compelled to respond to it in important ways, right? Now, for my purposes, and the reason why I talk about him in a book on liberal socialism is, again, very much influenced by C.P. Macpherson. I point out that Locke is very much the originator of a certain kind of workmanship ideal, right? This idea that property is largely the result of mixing your labor with the matter of the world, right? Which gives you a property entitlement to it, so long as you leave as good or more for everyone else, which is a very important qualifier, as some Lockean political theorists have pointed out, right? And this idea that labor is the basis of property is, of course, going to go on to have an enormous influence on not only liberals, but socialists for that matter, right? Many people have pointed out that Ricardian socialism, even Marxist socialism to a certain extent, still bears the stamp of this emphasis on labor through things like the labor theory of value. And Locke himself, of course, had something that looks a lot like a labor theory of value, where at one point he says, look, about 90% or so, I think is what it is. It's been a while since I've read the book, of the value in any commodity comes from the labor that's imbued with it, right? Nature provides a bit of the other stuff, but it's mostly human labor, right? And the fact that this emphasis on workmanship and labor is going to create enormous arrays of debates going forward between left-wing liberals and right-wing liberals, with a lot of right-wing liberals insisting, well, actually, it's the rich who've worked really hard, they've built their businesses, they shouldn't be taxed, and they should more or less be able to buy the labor of others at the price dictated by the market, right? That's putting it very simply. Whereas more left-wing liberals of the sort that Elizabeth Anderson, for instance, discusses in her books Hijack, will emphasize, well, actually, if we believe that labor creates an entitlement to property, let alone this idea that labor adds a lot of value to property, it's actually the workers who are getting a raw deal in a capitalist system, and we need to correct for some things like that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Anderson's work, because I have some, and you also seem to have some concerns about like the way people like McPherson understand Locke.
Yes,
Yeah.
I became convinced through her that McPherson is a little mean to Locke. And I mean, I like aspects of Locke also, right? I mean, I don't think you can be a leftist and not like Locke's revolutionary theory, for example, right? Because it was literally revolutionary, right? He's probably the first major political theorist to argue that people have a right to revolt. And I think McPherson's work is a little dated in that respect. But I share a lot of McPherson's concerns, again, about the way that Locke, or at least Lockeans, kind of pick up the Lockean workmanship ideal.
Yeah, I also have concerns about that, but we'll put a pin in that for a more critical discussion later in the show. Let's move on to some of the people who are more, you read as more deeply developed in developing the socialist strain of liberalism before there was like liberal socialism. So you have some interesting chapters on Thomas Paine and Wollstonecraft. I guess we'll start with Paine, as you do in the book. What can you tell me, like, a lot of like when I was a more right-wing conservative, I was hugely obsessed with like Paine's common sense, right? But you point out that like it, in a way that like I think a lot of Americans don't realize, even though he's like cited as perhaps the best propagandist of the founding fathers, right? This development of a liberal socialist or proto-liberal socialist, if you will, view of the relationship between the state and our capacities and so on. So what can you tell me about like the more liberal socialist moments in Paine's, especially more mature work?
Sure. Well, I'll just start with a little dig at Hayek here by pointing out that I think Paine is also an emblematic example of how this distinction between continental rationalism and Anglo-American majorism or moderation is wildly overstated, right? Thomas Paine used to say, we have it in our power to make the world anew or to begin the world anew, right? And interestingly enough, it was the kind of arch-conservative Ronald Reagan who used to like to quote that dictum of Paine's, right? So, you don't get much more revolutionary than that. But, Paine, I think, has long been appreciated, as you point out, as an enormously talented polemicist and political rhetorician, right? His work is spicy, funny, provocative, angry, right? It's very powerful that way. But he's only, I think, recently started to become appreciated as an innovative political theorist in his own right, which is the way that I treat him, right? So I point out that in Common Sense, he more or less lays out a fairly familiar kind of Lockean story about the need to undermine aristocracy, right? In Common Sense, he points out that a lot of the arguments for aristocracy are pretty ridiculous. Aristocracy violates the kind of natural equality that exists in nature. It doesn't really serve much of a purpose, and our natural rights will be much more respected within a republican system of government than in a monarchical or aristocratic system of government. All well and good, right? But by the time he gets to the French Revolution, and he's co-authoring, especially The Rights of Man, Part 2, and then later on pamphlets like Agrarian Justice, he starts to internalize this sense that actually we need to go beyond these kinds of Lockean cliches if we're genuinely to secure fully free and fully equal societies. So just to give an example, in The Rights of Man, Part 2, and especially in Agrarian Justice, Paine comes to the conclusion that private property is not a natural but a social institution, doesn't exist without the state. And the conclusions that he derives from this are that clearly the rich owe society a debt for the retention of their private property. And then actually echoing kind of left-wing Lockean ideas, he says that by dispossessing the poor of the land that was once held in common, the rich also owe the poor a serious debt, because obviously they're not making new land that the poor can just use to create their own little farmsteads. So he argues that this debt can be paid off through extensive taxes on the wealthy that'll be used to finance quite a generous welfare state, right? And I should add that Paine's understanding of how generous this welfare state should be only increased over time between The Rights of Man, Part 2, and Agrarian Justice. But just to kind of give it in broad strokes, he thinks that people should be guaranteed quality employment, right? not workhouses, kind of Scrooge-like, but they could go do a decent day's work, get remunerated for that while, have a place to sleep, and they could leave at any time they wanted to. People should enjoy a automatic inheritance upon a certain age. Obviously, public education would be provided for all. He thought that mothers should receive a stipend when they gave birth, which I think is quite a nice idea. It kind of reminds me of Mamdani's baby baskets, right? He also thought there should be things like old age pensions, all this kind of stuff, right? And again, by the standards of, say, the mid-20th century welfare states, Paine's arguments might seem a little bit dated, but they were extremely innovative for their time period. And I think he deserves an enormous amount of credit for being one of the first liberals to really take seriously this idea that a commitment to liberal equality requires a commitment to a material level of equality.
Yes. So you point out both Paine and Wollstonecraft have this like acidic way of dissolving and demystifying the established order in their rhetorical polemics. What do you think? Because, like, obviously, as a scholar, you don't seem to do that as much.
In my more popular writings, just read my reviews of Ben Shapiro or something. Pretty mean.
Yeah, sometimes you do. But what do you think the role for that in the 20th century or 21st century? Sorry, especially in light of the way the right has really taken up that way of engagement is for a liberal socialist these days.
Well, I think that what Wollstonecraft really demonstrates extremely effectively, maybe even more effectively than Paine, is how to prick at the pretensions and the mystifications that the right likes to advance.
Yeah, and the reifications.
Exactly, in order to defend his position. So in that book, I refer to how Wollstonecraft took real issue with Burke's ascription of these kind of sublime, almost theological qualities onto the monarchy. So just to kind of step back for a second, in Reflections on the Revolution in France, Burke actually self-consciously says, look, whenever man is going to be elevated over man, it's very important to ascribe these kind of sublime qualities to them. And then religion should be organized in order to back up the ascription of these sublime qualities. Because if a king is just a man and a queen is just a woman, then people are always going to be asking, well, why should I listen to them, right? Why should I give a shit about some guy in a very stupid hat on a great big chair and how he thinks I should organize my life just because he happens to be part of the degenerate House of Bourbon or whatever it is, right? So you need to instead think of them as part of the Sun King's lineage, right? Ordained by God to rule over the French people, that kind of thing, right? And Wollstonecraft really takes serious issue with this, where she says, look, saying we should prefer the pleasing illusions, to use Burke's own term, right? To understanding the way that the world really is and recognizing authority for how it really operates demonstrates a mortal antipathy to reason, is Wollstonecraft's kind of terminology, right? She says, in fact, leaning heavily into these very aesthetic modes of thinking about things, right, is so contrary to what reason demands of us that Burke, she says, doesn't even really have many arguments for why it is that we should prefer the monarchy to a republican system of government. What she thinks his arguments really just boil down to is this kind of filial sentimentality, right? This idea that we should reverence the figures to which we have shown obedience for a long time, in the same way that we reverence the ivory that is old and growing on the wall. And she says, sure, some people might like to bow and scrape to Louis XVI, because they imagine that elevates them in some way, shape, or form. In the same way that some people might like to lazily and slovenly sit in their backyards and just look at the ivy all day, right? But she says the minute that the ivy stops or inhibits new growth, no one would hesitate to cut it down, right? And she thinks the time is long past when we should be getting rid of the old useless aristocracies and replace them with a more dynamic, active, educated republic, right? Now, what I point out in the book is that this side to Wollstonecraft's work has always been, I think, underappreciated, right? Since she's most familiar, rightly so, for her work advocating for women's equality, right? And again, it's a very important contribution, seminal contribution to the history of political thought, but her broader political convictions are less explored. And I point out that actually she extended this kind of disposition and the skepticism towards those who reverence power and wealth to the nouveau rich, the bourgeois, right? Something that's also been less appreciated about her work. So for a long time, the kind of standard narrative was, well, Wollstonecraft is critical of the old aristocracy, the way every liberal was. But more or less, again, she kind of fell within this kind of classical Lockean paradigm of defending private property rights. Actually, what I point out is that if you read her letters from Scandinavia, right? While she was traveling around Germany, she actually says that the nouveau riche, the bourgeois and the capitalists, are in many ways worse than the old aristocracy. She compares them to a kind of fungus that's mushrooming up all over Northern Europe and just consuming the sustenance of wherever kind of town they happen to be leeching off of, right? And she says, look, at least the old aristocratic rich, for all they were extremely silly, and she never denies that they were, right? It's an extraordinarily stupid idea to have an aristocracy. She said they had this sense of noblesse oblige grounded in their sentimental and mythological ideas about what God had required for them, which meant that at least sometimes they felt compelled to not think about themselves and to think about the broader world around them. She says the nouveau rich don't even bother doing that at all. For them, all that they are concerned with is the bottom line. That's it. And in A Vindication of the Rights of Women, she says, it's from this propensity to reverence people like that, as though from a poison chalice, that all the corruption of our moral sentiments come. And contemporary readers of Wollstonecraft have pointed out that she more or less advocated for a fairly equal distribution of property, not social ownership of the means of production, but the idea is that each of us will more or less have the same amount of money, same amount of land, that kind of thing. So very egalitarian instincts, rather like Paine.
Yes, I could talk for days about the weird and complicated relationship between Burke and the liberal tradition.
Oh yes.
But yeah, so I do like that how you highlight like Wollstonecraft in particular is really good at like demythologizing. And I think one criticism that I've long had of Hayek is how he like put Burke in this category of British Anglo-empiricism, empiricist individualism, as opposed to this problematic French liberalism.
I mean, if I could just interject there for one second, because I think you're absolutely right. I mean, look, without a doubt, Burke can be prudentialist and wise at points. You know, I've argued this always, right? You know, that Burke is
his writings
right.
on awe, where he like preempts some of the British romantics in certain ways about like sublimity, can be very enlightening.
Yeah, absolutely. But I point out that whenever somebody sits there and they're like, well, Burke is resistant to abstractions, I'm like, go look at his idea of the social contract, right? You know, he says that he goes way beyond even Rousseau and Locke and says that society is a contract, but it's a contract between the living, the dead, and those yet to be, right? And that's a massively more, to use Wollstonecraft's terminology, Gothic and abstract idea of the social contract than anything you find in Hobbes and Locke, right? One could almost point out that there's something audacious about projecting such an ambitious idea, the social contract. So I've never been one of those people who's like, well, Burke is a good common sense guy.
Yeah, I haven't either. Like I wrote a whole paper when I was an undergrad at University of Michigan, in fact, writing
Go Blue.
Yeah, go Blue. Writing second gen grad, go Blue. Writing this criticism of specifically like Burke's really problematic and I think very authoritarian intergenerational version of the social contract theory. And like it's funny, like Wollstonecraft points out how he doesn't have a good criticism of the more radical liberals of his day. Are you familiar with his Vindication of a Natural Society?
Yes. The work he came was a satire later on. I read it some time ago, right? And I mean, look, I think that Burke is a very complicated figure, and I don't want to dismiss his contribution.
Right.
I would say that alongside Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, Burke is at the very apex of right-wing thought, albeit, you know, in a less systematic way than some of the others, right? But he develops, even creates a lot of the kind of intuitions and core convictions that are going to be picked up by more systematic thinkers, right? But I think that what makes Burke complicated in terms of understanding his relationship to liberalism, and this is a point made in a good book called The Rage of Edmund Burke, is that he's continuously torn between a kind of veneration of the old aristocratic society and a desire to defend it, and falling into his own kind of bourgeois convictions that a more meritocratic, capitalist, upwardly mobile kind of society should replace the old aristocratic system, right? And you see this in a lot of his writings on political economy, for example, right, where he's pretty fiercely defensive.
Well, he's at his most liberal, in fact, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? And it's very hard to square that with his reverence for the aristocracy and the feudal system and things like the Reflections of the Revolution in France. So I think he was a very complicated personality who was torn between a world that he saw dying but had a lot of respect for, and a new world that he was quite excited about but couldn't bring himself to love.
Yeah, and like to like return to like where I was going with the vindication of natural society, he like presents this overwhelmingly like almost convincing argument, and it's meant to be a reductio ad absurdum of Lord who was it, Lord Bolingbroke.
Mm-hmm.
But like, and it's like so convincing that even people like Murray Rothbard were like trying to argue that it wasn't satirical, very probably dishonestly and unconvincingly to me. But like if you were to like follow through some of the more like liberal points to their natural conclusions, he recognized it looked something very much like what we defend at the Center for Stateless Society, right? And he didn't seem to have any good way to go to that. So like, I really object to Hayek's like categorizing him as a nice, epistemically humble, empiricist, precisely because he still has these like, vulgar aspirations for the capacities of humanity to like be able to access the transcendental good in some way that I don't think Hayek himself thought was possible.
No, absolutely. And I mean, look, we've been kind of mean to Hayek. I have a lot of respect for Hayek.
He's my favorite social thinker of the 20th century, to be clear.
Sure. Yeah, no, I don't doubt that, right? Yeah. I think that Hayek, I don't want to sound too Straussian here, is not a particularly good reader of the Western canon because he's a very good original thinker, right? So he clearly draws inspiration from a lot of these figures and kind of ex post facto turns them into little steps in the genealogy towards his own thought, right? And look, a lot of great thinkers are prone to doing that.
Richard Rorty did that a lot.
yeah, Richard Rorty did that a lot. I mean, are Heidegger and Wittgenstein really, contemporaries are just little James Deweys? I don't think so, right? But if you're an original thinker of great power, the way that Hayek was, then my feeling is go by all means engage in a violent reading of figures if you need to do so in order to develop your own original insights. I think the problem comes when other people pick up these misreadings of major figures in the history of political thought and just assume they're correct without going back and looking at the text themselves and realizing that things are more complicated than that.
Yes. So moving on to who you call the first liberal socialist, which I might quibble with, but nonetheless, your writing on J.S. Mill is very interesting. So like,
thank you.
A lot of people like to count J.S. Mill in like the classical liberal tradition because of his emphasis on political economy, especially in his younger works. But you emphasize the ways that Mill, especially in his more mature works, turns into a liberal socialist. So can you comment about like the more socialist dimension to Mill that maybe a lot of people haven't recognized?
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't think it should be controversial that Mill is a socialist because he said he was a socialist, right? In his biography, he's like, I categorize myself under the general designation of socialist and took great pride in now seeing beyond the kind of classical bourgeois economics that he had advocated for earlier, right? So then the question becomes, well, how do we periodize Mills's work and what enacted this kind of transition? And for those who are interested, there's a fantastic book written by Dr. Helen McCabe called John Stuart Mill, Socialist, where she spends hundreds of pages just tracing how Mill didn't quite change his mind, but how his thought evolved in a more socialist direction, right? But to make a very long and complicated story a little bit shorter, what McCabe points out, and I follow her in this, is that Mill was never disinterested in socialism, right? He had a lot of contempt for Owenism, which was a popular stream of thought in England at the time, but he had a lot of respect for the kind of epistocratic elitism of Saint-Simonian socialism, right? The idea that we should have experts who manage the economy and manage society in order to bring about beneficent outcomes, even though he was always wary of some of the...
all the stuff Hayek hated about the content. Yeah.
Exactly. But, Mill is a little bit more sympathetic towards it, even though he's already a little bit wary of the kind of statism that he sees as potentially accruing to these Saint-Simonian ideas. And, McCabe points out that if he wasn't aware of Marx by name, he at least had familiarized himself with some of Marx's more popular writings, even if he didn't, again, know who it was, and had written about them approvingly, right? So Mill, in his mature phase, comes to the conclusion that capitalists, by and large, don't serve much of a useful purpose in a market economy, right? Because he remains a market socialist. He says, look, capitalists clearly bring some know-how and some managerial expertise, but this is nothing that the workers can't or shouldn't provide for themselves under ideal circumstances. And so what he proposed was a transition to, from an economics perspective, a kind of cooperative market society where workers would own and manage the means of production for themselves without capitalists. And he thought that this would not only induce efficiency, because the workers working for themselves would feel more compelled to work hard, but it would also be morally uplifting in a certain way, since Mill was determined to eliminate all forms of aristocratic obsequiousness, and he felt that a lot of that persisted in the workplace, where workers had to bow and scrape towards the boss. Sadly, as they say, the more things change, the more things stay the same, right? Very similar to this day. And as Gary Dorian points out, in each edition of the Principles of Political Economy became more socialist than the last, as his convictions around this hardened. But in addition to these more kind of economic and experimentalist arguments, which also include, I should say, a commitment to a robust welfare state, which Mill also hypothesized on, Mill also makes much more straightforwardly moral and philosophical arguments for a kind of socialism in chapters on socialism. Some of these actually anticipate the later writings of liberals like Rawls, for example, right? So Mill argues that one of the primary arguments that's often used to justify a capitalist society are what we now call meritocratic arguments. This idea that hard work should be the basis of reward, which I should add, Rawls and Hayek both take issue with in their own way. Rightly so, I'd say. And Mill says, look, if we actually took this kind of meritocratic argument seriously, then we would require a very different and more equal society than the one we have right now. Because he says a lot of the people who work the hardest in our society and actually do the most vital jobs, the chimney sweeps, the people who mine coal, all that kind of stuff, they receive very little remuneration for that, very little social prestige, and they end up living very short, very hard lives, right? By contrast, he points out, plenty of people are born into rich families, don't lift a finger for their entire life, and die rich, right? Because they were lucky enough to have won the genetic lottery. So Mill said, if we actually took seriously these kinds of quasi-meritocratic arguments for capitalism, we'd require a much more kind of socialist economy where the workers would end up having a lot more, and the rich would be, as it were, fleeced in order to provide for that, right? Now, Mill offers a variety of other arguments in the book for the kind of socialism that he prefers that would be, again, quite anti-statist, right? In fact, he offers some prophetic criticisms of the more statist versions of socialism that are already starting to emerge, right? So, again, but a very, very provocative set of ideas and forward-thinking in many ways.
Good. So let's move on to another chapter that you have in the book, which is
Sure.
one of the you argue one of the most central chapters in the book, or your chapter on Karl Marx. A lot of people in the liberal tradition read Marx as one of the biggest critics and enemies of liberalism, but you point out to more like humane parts of Marx where he's sympathetic to liberalism. But let's start with, what is Karl Marx's criticism of liberalism as like an ideology of capitalists, and why do you find it wanting?
Sure. Well, one of the things I should point out kind of autobiographically is when people ask me why it is that I think that Marx has useful things to say to liberals, what I always point out is you don't need to take my word for it, right? It's actually many of the sharpest critics on the political right who have always noted that there are deep elective affinities between liberalism and socialism and Marxism, for that matter, right?
McIntyre, yeah.
Yeah. Alistair McIntyre makes that point, but then so too does Nietzsche, so does Heidegger, right? Heidegger used to say that socialism and capitalism were metaphysically the same. And that's because they recognize that Marxism, rather like liberalism, certainly in its 19th century form, was a mature Enlightenment doctrine that was committed to ultimately a kind of economic understanding of the material roots of human flourishing, right? And seen from, say, a Heideggerian perspective, what that means is that Marxists and Hayekians, for example, are mostly arguing about the best way to build and distribute refrigerators, right? But they all are convinced that the best thing to do is to design better refrigerators more efficiently and then distribute them as effectively as possible, right? Which means that they're very similar in many ways. So getting more to the kind of root of your question, what I point out is that Marx is a dialectical thinker and historical thinker par excellence, which means that anytime you see somebody who is presenting him as simply a critic of something, they're interpreting Marx incorrectly, right? Because just being a critic of something is being resolutely undialectical in your approach to the subject matter, right? Marx applauded capitalism and liberalism as, without a doubt, the highest form of society that had come into existence thus far, right? In his early career, Marx could very, very readily be called a kind of radical liberal. Of course, he grew up in the authoritarian Prussian regime. He advocated for things like freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. He was an especially militant proponent of things like freedom of the press, which makes a lot of sense when you realize that Marx was basically exiled from German state to German state, and his newspapers were constantly shut down, and his academic career was ruined, and he was silenced by the censors, right? So he had a lot of sympathy for things like that. And he never gave up on this belief that bourgeois society, of course, was the best form of society that had existed thus far, right? His criticisms of it are nuanced, careful, and very rarely thoughtless, even if they are pointed at some junctures. So I don't want to rehash a lot of the kind of classical Marxist critiques of liberalism, because there are a lot of them. I'll just foreground two, right, that are especially germane for our purposes. So one of the criticisms that Marx makes of liberalism that any anarchist should be sympathetic to is he points out that there's a kind of paradoxical way that rights are framed within liberalism. On the one hand, almost every liberal understands that rights are primarily supposed to be rights against the state, right? This is the kind of, again, Lockean ethos that we see underpinning a lot of libertarianism to this day, right? Get the big government off my back. But what Marx points out is that every liberal also accepted that the state was a necessary condition for these rights to be efficacious in any way, shape, or form. And this especially became a kind of mature position by the time you get to people like Bentham, or for that matter, by the time you get to people like Hayek, right? That rights only mean something if you have a state that's willing to enforce your rights. In fact, it really only means something if you have a state that's willing to enforce your rights against the state and state officials, right? And Marx points out that this is inherently a fairly unstable way of defending the rights of man, right? Because you're relying on the state to defend people or to protect people's rights against the state, right? Which leads to all kinds of ideological and practical tensions. Another important criticism that Marx makes of a kind of Lockean version of liberalism is, of course, this critique of the labor theory of entitlement, is what we might call it, right? This idea that hard work should be the basis of reward. And I mentioned that Mill already comes up with an iteration of this, right? So Marx's arguments for the labor theory of value are very complicated. I don't think that ultimately they're sustainable, right? I think that they just don't work very well for reasons that are familiar to a lot of people. But one of the things that he does point out is that if you took seriously this Lockean idea that mixing your labor with the matter of the world entitles you to property rights over what you create, which he points out is central to a lot of bourgeois ideology at the time, as now, would actually lead you in the direction of Ricardian socialism, right? The idea that, well, it's actually workers that that contribute the most labor to producing the commodities of the world. But despite that, they get far less reward than the capitalist, who does not actually labor nearly as much as all of his workers, right? And Marx was also critical of how these kinds of Lockean ideas aren't extended sufficiently. So in a middle chapter of Capital Volume 1, he very presently points out, look, a lot of these Lockean and Montesquieuian arguments about the need to divide powers, to protect freedom of expression and freedom of assembly, they're all well and good, right? We should defend those things. But it's notable, he says, that liberals fall silent on their importance whenever a worker ends up on the factory floor, where all of a sudden, again, all the good old despotisms just reintroduce themselves, right? Workers have no agency. They're not allowed to express themselves. They're certainly not allowed to assemble themselves to form unions in the 19th century capitalist context, all that kind of stuff, right? So again, I think sharp criticisms of liberalism from Marx, and we can multiply them quite voluminously from there, right? Now, in terms of what Marx thinks the solution to all these should be, as is well known, Marx wrote very little about what socialism or communism were supposed to look like. Disappointingly little, really, right? And part of this was intentional. He's often critical of this idea that we should write recipe books for the cook shops of the future, in his famous phrase, because he associates that with a kind of utopian rationalism, which is why I think, for instance, many Hayekians have misread Marx, as Schiabara points out, right? You'd be very hard-pressed to find anybody who's much more critical of coming up with schemes for the future than Marx, at least in his canonical form. Nonetheless, he does sometimes make suggestive remarks about what kind of society should replace bourgeois society. But even there, things are more complicated than just a wholesale rejection of liberalism. So just give an example in the Critique of the Gotha program, right, which is one of the last works Marx wrote and published under his own name. He's very critical of the SPD and the German socialists, who he thinks are again giving into these utopian millenarian ambitions, suggesting that, look, once we get rid of capitalist society, everything will be changed. This kind of Jacobin conceit, right? That there'll be this millenarian break. And Marx says, no, any kind of transition to socialism is going to be historical and materially mediated. That means the new socialist society is going to be, to use his terminology, profoundly stamped by many features of the old bourgeois capitalist order. Which means that you're going to have many bourgeois institutions, bourgeois rights, bourgeois laws that'll persist in a socialist society. And it's only going to be over a long period of time when a socialist society is able to develop the means of production to a sufficient height that we might be able to move towards an entirely new concept of right, predicated on the principle of from each according to his ability to each according to their needs, right? So it's, again, a very dialectical and very historical and materialist approach to change in a socialist direction that appreciates that liberalism is going to be around, or at least liberal principles of right are going to be around for quite a while, even in a socialist society. Do I think that Marx is therefore a liberal socialist? No, I want to be very clear about that, because a few people have misread my book already as suggesting that. But I think that there's a lot that liberals and liberal socialists can learn from looking in the Marxist tradition. For an appreciation of its failures, to be clear, also, things like the labor theory of value, but also for an appreciation of its deep insights into the nature of economic power and history.
Right. So I really like emphasizing, some of the more liberal moments in Marx. One of the most wildly underrated Austrian economists in my mind, David Pritchko, wrote a whole book doing that. But like, what Pacheco asks in his book is, like, there's this deep tension between these moments in Marx where he wants to abolish the anarchy of production of capitalism.
Yes.
And, there's even moments where him and Engels talk about things like the dictatorship of the proletariat that does seem deeply illiberal, and this, like, affinity for central planning that he seems to have. Mm-hmm. How do you square this, like, democratic, humane Marx who really wants workplace democracy, these quotes where he's talking about how, like, man should be plowman in the morning, or be free to be a plowman in the morning, a fisherman in the afternoon, and then a critic in the evening. Like, how do you square those, like, more normatively individualist moments in Marx with these, like, calls for complete planning in society and a dictatorship of the proletariat?
Sure. Well, I mean, Marx, I think, was a great thinker, and like all great thinkers, he's prone to extraordinary lapses of judgment and very clear contradictions in his writing, right? And part of this is also because a lot of his projections about the future are ironically very much overdetermined by the present, right? Whenever there was a revolution breaking out, he sometimes gets a little bit more ambitious about hypothesizing what the future might look like. And then inevitably, the revolution is crushed, and he goes back to his good old chastisement of the utopian socialists for trying to write recipe books for the cookshops of the future. In terms of your answer to that question, I think that a lot of the, let's call it bad, illiberal stuff in Marx originates in the Communist Manifesto. There, I do think that Marx is prone to giving in to what's sometimes referred to as the temptations of democratic centralism, right? The idea that he calls it a dictatorship of the proletariat, but eventually that's going to give way to the idea that the whole of society is going to manage the whole of society's affairs at all times, right? And I think that that's an enormously problematic viewpoint. Now, I don't think that Marx can be blamed for how Marxists, Leninists, and Stalinists, of course, misinterpreted this as a call for a permanent dictatorship, not of the proletariat even, but of people like Stalin, the leader of the Bolshevik Party. But, without a doubt, he provides theoretical ammunition in the Communist Manifesto and some other early works for those who might want to read him that way. And he should be very criticized for that, right? But I think that Marx self-corrects on those points by the time you get to things like the Civil War in France, for example, right? Where he actually moves away from a commitment to a kind of democratic centralism to a much more kind of radically, deliberatively democratic system of government that's problematic in its own right, right? So in the Civil War in France, drawing upon the experience of the French revolutionaries. He says, look, a future communist society might look like this. And again, it's always a might, right? We're going to have a central national legislature where we're going to have representatives who will stand in for the people. But these can be immediately recalled whenever the people get dissatisfied with them, which is an extremely radical idea, right? Imagine if the minute a majority was unhappy with their senator or the president or even their congressman, they can just recall them and replace them with someone else, right? And he says, this national legislature is going to be in many ways quite weak. The reason being that what we want are local communes to play a major role in organizing their social life and their economic life for themselves, which makes sense if you're a Marxist, right? The idea is that Bordeaux and Orleans and Marseille, they're going to take some direction from the central national government, but by and large, they're going to be self-organizing, democratic, very localist in their kind of orientation, and involve the people in the region in their own self-governance, right? Now, I think you can be critical of this later Marxist vision of a kind of hyper-democratic society, precisely because it might be too hyper-democratic, right? I'm with a lot of critics of this aspect, this form of socialism, and saying that if socialism is a series of endless meetings where I need to be involved in municipal planning day in and day out, because I'm supposed to have to say in everything that governs or touches upon me, then that sounds like an awful lot of work when I'd rather dedicate my time to other things, right? But you can't criticize this view for being democratically centralist or dictatorial in any kind of way. If anything, it leans too far in the opposite direction of this kind of hyper participatory system. So again, I think that trying to extrapolate too many political conclusions about the future that Marx wanted is something of a fool's errand, precisely because he wrote so little about this. He changed his mind constantly. He contradicted himself all over the place, right?
He criticized the utopian socialists for doing precisely that, right?
Yeah, and exactly. And by and large, at his best moments, he's pretty critical of the utopian socialists for doing just that, right? So I think that if we're going to be critical of him, then there are a lot of other things that are more worthy of criticism, like the classical labor theory of value, for us to dedicate our attention to.
Let's move on to Chantal Mouffe, someone you discussed who I was less familiar with. And you express at times a sort of ambivalence towards this way Mouffe defends a sort of left populism.
Sure.
And I'm kind of in line with contemporary people like Sheikha Dalmia, who think that populism is inherently going to turn a liberal at some point, and I'm deeply suspicious. Some of my public writing when I was active in libertarian place were taking libertarian populists, following the tradition of Rothbard, to task, because it seems to me there's a deep, divide between the liberal commitment that no one should have final authority over others, and the populist commitment that the current people in authority are bad, and we, the people, need to take authority from them, right? So how. And I've always kind of cast a side eye to contemporary liberal socialists, such as yourself at times, for supporting people like Bernie Sanders, who just me is at times an illiberal socialist, in his comments on immigration. So what do you take to be what liberal socialists should learn from Mouffe about left populism?
Well, like you, I have an ambiguous relationship with her, or an ambivalent appreciation of her work, right? This also might partly date me because, I'm a millennial and I came of age when her co-authored book, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, was kind of the post-structuralist take on socialism that everyone read. And like a lot of millennials, I came to find this distasteful, to put it politely, and ended up rejecting it. And so I've always had a little bit of wariness for some of her arguments going forward, right? Although that might be unfair, right? She certainly changed her views. So Mouffe starts to identify as a liberal socialist in the 1990s in an article she wrote for Dissent. She's very much inspired by other self-described liberal socialists like the Italian Umberto Bobbio, who's an interesting political theorist in his own respect, extremely learned and worth reading. And this continues to this day when she calls for a kind of left populism. Now, like you, I think that there are inherently dangerous features to this that are sometimes understated by her. And just to give one example, Mouffe is quite fond of, that's the wrong word, she's very influenced by Carl Schmitt, who some of your listeners might know is a great illiberal fascist juror, who, to be fair, does offer some very legitimate criticisms of liberal political and legal ideology, right? Schmidt can't just be dismissed offhand. But one of the things that she draws from Schmidt is this idea that politics is always a agonistic contest, right? There's always going to be friends and enemies. And what you want to do is, of course, mobilize as many friends as possible to pursue your political projects at the expense of someone else's, right? And what she argues for in her books on left populism is saying, look, what we need to recognize is that the left and liberal socialists need an enemy to mobilize people around. If we don't have that, then we're going to be unable to form the kind of coalition that's necessary in order to enact structural change. And so contemporary oligarchy, racism, sexism, and all the people who advocate for it, that can serve as our kind of Schmittian style enemy. Now, like you, I think that there are serious dangers with this kind of agonism, right? Because I think that, broadly speaking, liberals need to be committed to this idea that a democratic amelioration of political concerns is properly carried out through deliberation and interest management rather than through agonistic confrontation. And I think there's something extremely dangerous about leaning too heavily on that, right? Now, on the other hand, I point out that what Mouffe is correct to say is that it's also possible to move too far in the other direction, which is a temptation that political theorists like yourself and myself, right, are always prone to, which is just, well, society would be better off if politics was carried out more like a graduate level seminar in anarchist or liberal political theory, where the best argument will prevail. And that way, we all will rationally agree when our argument has been defeated and defer to the better claim. This kind of Socratic, dictum, right? And Mouffe points out, well, look, that might be nice. Maybe if we're all little Habermasians, it'd be possible. But real politics doesn't tend to operate that way, right? Real politics, you tend to need to have heroes and villains, stories, mobilizing passions, that kind of thing. And I think she's right to point out that liberal socialists, like Rawls, for example, right, lean too far in the direction of things like ideal theorization, right, or suggesting that all we need to do is make compelling arguments for the best theory of justice and people buy into them, right? So I think that she offers an important rejoinder to those of us who are too tempted to excessively abstract theorization as a substitute for real politics. But like you, I share a lot of your concerns about the dangers of leaning heavily on agonistic approaches to politics and friend-enemy distinctions.
Yeah, not to spend too much time on this, but it's something I find really interesting. It seems to me like there's a lot of contemporary liberals, maybe who aren't socialists. I have in mind like post-Humean people like Annette Baer and Richard Rorty, who
Sure.
draw that we can get these narratives and stuff through like sentimental education. Contemporary Adam Smith people are all like this, where we tell a story about people suffering and the addressing meaning of their suffering. Rorty talks about, that's basically his vision of what solidarity looks like. He also has some nationalist stuff that I have no taste for, but that is a huge part of this empathetic, Humean Smithian project of getting people to expand their loyalties to more and more people. Is a story that you can tell without the agonism. Is kind of something I think. So could you comment briefly on whether you think that's like a worthwhile project, or what you think Mouffe would say the limits of that are?
Sure. I mean, I would ideally like us all to be little sentimental, rational, deliberative liberals, right?
Well, that's what I like about Rorty, because he points out how it's not really being that rational and deliberative, right?
No. I mean, definitely Rorty leads in that direction. Actually, it's fun. Sorry, go ahead, please.
Maybe he takes it too far in that direction, is all I was saying.
Sure. I mean, a lot of people pointed out that it's odd that Rorty didn't appear in my book because he asked those very important questions. And my kind of cheap out on that is I was only given 100,000 words and I used 110,000 words. And so my editor was like, you got to cut some shit out, right? And so, I was going to talk about Dewey and Rorty, and then, that chapter just got axed. So my apologies, right?
Maybe that can be in the next book, right?
Yeah. It's just, you can't do everything, right? But I did want to address that, precisely because I think it's a very interesting claim. Look, I think that, if you look at historically existent liberalism and socialism, it's very clear that Mouffe is correct, that it's hard to mobilize people's passions for liberal projects without a kind of agonistic dimension to it. Just to give a very easy example, right? The Democratic Party in the United States and liberals in the United States have now basically used the orange boogeyman as their primary foil for the better part of 10 years now, right? And I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon. And that's because you can be like yourself or me, as much as you want and say, well, really, Trump is just a symptom. It's really about the structural problems in the United States, whatever those happen to be. We need to fix those because they're the real basis of the problem. Fair enough, right? But people need a villain, right? Or people want a villain that they can project a lot of those antagonisms onto. And, I'm as subject to those appeals as anyone else, right? I remember when Trump lost the election in 2020. I was brutally hungover the day afterwards because I was up all night celebrating because I was very happy about it, right? And socialism also has a lot of these kinds of tensions within it, right? From a purely kind of Marxist standpoint, you should be critical of individual capitalists for what it is that they're doing, because capitalists are just as subject to the mute compulsion of economic necessity as anyone else. They're fulfilling a social function in our historically determined mode of production, right? There can be nice capitalists and there can be mean capitalists, but ultimately capitalists as a whole, they're just part of the social sphere. They're not good or bad individually in and of themselves. Well, you can talk at the kind of high theoretical level as much as you want, but almost every successful socialist movement has at some point or another realized that, to your Bernie Sanders example, it helps a lot when you sit there and you say, well, Elon Musk is the bad guy, right? Elon Musk and people like him are the oligarchs that are running the country and we need to put a stop to them, because that gives a kind of human face to his antagonisms that resonates a lot more with ordinary people than abstractions, right? We need to confront the capitalist mode of production as a kind of systemic totality, right? And of course, I don't need to tell you or any of your listeners that the political right is just rife with all kinds of agonisms, right? Fear of Muslims, fear of liberals, fear of socialists, right? Fear of, every single trans person who gains a following above 100, right? You name it, right? So it's just very hard to, as much as it might be distasteful, to ignore that, to say that Noof doesn't have a point in stressing that real politics is probably always going to have these kinds of characteristics. Even if, like yourself, I would hope that one day we'd be able to move on to a better world where it would no longer be necessary. I just don't know.
All right, so that was good. Let's. I wanted to discuss the chapters on the chapter on Mills and racial liberalism, but
sure.
We're wanting for time a little bit. So okay. I guess we'll move on for a minute to and you can discuss this a bit. And what you discuss is like the shortcomings of liberal socialist tradition.
Sure.
And one of them is very related to Mills and also some of the like feminist critics of liberalism. So let's start with like, what do you take those shortcomings to be?
There's quite a few of them, right? I mean, I actually think that Charles Mills isn't unique here, right? I actually say that left libertarians have also kind of internalized a lot of this wisdom, especially recently, if you think about people like Jacob T. Levy, for example, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Or for that matter, John Tomasky or Matt Zolinsky, people have Aaron Powell, people have a lot of respect
Kevin
for, right?
Valier, et cetera. Yeah,
exactly, right. I think that there's been a very broad reckoning, certainly since the 1990s, with the fact that many strains of liberalism and libertarianism have either been silent on issues of racial and gender justice, particularly racial justice, right? Or they've actively been complicit in advancing racist arguments, defending racist systems. That includes many figures in the liberal socialist tradition, right? I point out that John Stuart Mill is a commendable figure in many ways, right? Abolitionist, obviously, a fierce proponent of women's suffrage and women's equality. All of that is very, 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 very commendable, right? But he was also, a fierce defender of British imperialism and called for despotism in much of the world, at least much of the world that he considered to be insufficiently civilized, right? And I think that there's a lot of good that people like Charles Mills and the others who I mentioned are doing by drawing attention to the fact that we need to take the racism of liberalism and libertarianism seriously, right? And Mills points out that there's a kind of easy way of letting ourselves off the hook for this, which is just saying, Mills's imperialism was peripheral to his thought, or Kant's elaborate and very crude racial typography is ancillary to his arguments about the importance of pure reason, challenging heteronomy, and all this stuff. But I think that all the people I mentioned point out that no, it goes deeper than that, right? It's very hard to actually separate a lot of them John Stuart Mill type worldview from a commitment to British imperialism. It's very hard to separate, Kant's arguments about the importance of using one's reasons for oneself with his declarations that some types of races just will always be incapable of doing that. And I think that we're still at the beginnings of a long process of kind of purging the liberal tradition of these inclinations through what will probably be quite a painful process of reevaluation, right? Now, saying that, I agree with Charles Mills and the others that I mentioned that as much as we have to implicate much of the liberal and libertarian and socialist traditions for their racism, that doesn't mean that a lot of the core normative principles that they espoused are deficient in some way, shape, or form, right? We just need to rework or rethink what they are going to mean in a liberal or socialist or liberal socialist tradition that has sufficiently thought through the legacies of racism and how to offset that legacy.
All right. So what about the other weaknesses of liberal socialist tradition that you talk about towards the end of the book?
Sure.
What are those, and how do you think they could be addressed?
Well, I think that there are several, right? I mentioned before that my book is not a hagiography of liberal socialism, right, and it's not my own personal defense of liberal socialism, right? Mm-hmm. My own defense of liberal socialism would be Rawlsian Marxism or Marxo-Rawlsianism, whatever you call it, because I tend to have a lot more sympathy for Marx than many liberal socialists do. But to make a long story very short, I think that there are two major weaknesses to liberal socialism as it has existed historically. One has been the failure to understand capitalism adequately as a global systematic totality, right? And this pertains back to what I was saying earlier about the way that figures like John Stuart Mill either didn't adequately think through how the market or capitalist society was embedded within British imperialism or actively defended it, right? And, the same can be said of figures like, say, John Rawls, for example. I have a lot of admiration for John Rawls, but his understanding of global justice and global capitalism is extraordinarily thin and extraordinarily weak, right? Mm-hmm. In his book, The Law of Peoples, he makes a couple of gestures towards the idea that, well, developing countries should be offer a little bit of succor by developed states, and that'd be the nice thing to do, but they aren't strictly demands. Just very, very, very milquetoast, very weak sauce type of stuff, right?
Yeah, good time to plug a book that one of our scholars at the Center wrote called "Radicalizing Rawls," specifically addressing the weaknesses of his Law of the Peoples.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just without reservation his worst book, right? Mm-hmm. Not an embarrassment, but it's just really, really bad, right? And I'm somebody who has enormous respect for Rawls, right? So I think that a sufficiently rejuvenated liberal socialism is going to be much more sensitive to the nature of capitalism as a global systematic totality and be much more cognizant of the nature of things like imperialism, for example, probably, again, drawing very heavily on the Marxist tradition. Another thing, perhaps even more important, that I think liberal socialism needs to do is to draw on the resources of critical theory and recognize the way that ideology in its various different forms poses a barrier to people thinking through their social world and their social convictions in a sufficiently rational way. So this is a point that, say, Sheldon Wolin makes in his book, Politics and Vision, when he's critical of people like Rawls, for example, where he says, look, Rawls in his heart of hearts is still a good Kantian, right? He believes that people have this capacity to reason, even if, we need thought experiments to explain how that's done. And he doesn't really appreciate all the ways that reason can be distorted in our contemporary society, right? And I think that this is very, very true, right? I think that we need to follow Marx in recognizing that ideology poses substantial epistemic barriers to political reform, and that these epistemic barriers aren't purely cognitive, although they partly are, right? They emerge because of the social forms that we inhabit. They are necessary illusions, as it's sometimes referred to, that's thrown up by our social relations, right? And until liberal socialists become much more critical of the role that ideology plays, we're unlikely to develop a robust and very critical liberal socialist politics, right? And there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done there, right? But again, I want to point out that my book, in addition to not being a defense or a hagiography isn't intended to be, some kind of definitive work, right? I don't want people to kind of do what I do with liberal socialism. I mean, I've even seen that some followers of your school are saying that I'm wrong and there should be more anarchist kind of liberal socialism, right? I just kind of wanted to open the door a little bit to thinking about these issues and suggest what I think a good path going forward would be, right? I'm very interested in people like the book in seeing where they think we should go with these lines of thought instead, because I think there's a lot more that can be done.
Right. So let's move into that because I am one of those people who has a concern that like you're not giving enough attention to the anti-statist features of what might be called the liberal socialist tradition. So like another feature you point out in the book is that that liberal socialists are too wedded to statist conceptions of justice in certain ways. And I think that's deeply right. And like right in a way, I'll put a pin in that for now. And let's talk about like some of the other like criticisms. I have more of your understanding of the history of the liberal tradition. So one of the defining features that you like point out is a gap between classic liberals and liberal socialists, right? Or high liberals, however we want to talk about it. Is this question of methodological individualism versus collectivism. And it just seems to me like a lot of classic liberals who typically get grouped in with as ontological individualists in some very deep reified sense just weren't really committed to those views, right? Like there's moments in Human Action where Mises says like social science, the praxeologist in his weird idiosyncratic language, like has to consider social wholes like states and nations and races and so on as an important like feature of understanding what the social world is. He insists because people like act as if they're real and it structures their action. And he's like influenced by like Bernstein traditions of Bernstein, traditions of like interpretive sociology, like Max Weber and people like that, and that saying that insofar as like they have like this perception of these social wholes as real and construct their identity around them or something like that, we have to treat them as real, right? And he says like methodological individualism is not committed to arguing whether social wholes are sui generis or these ontological things almost. He even like expresses a sense of frustration with like dwelling on those questions. And like Hayek similarly does very similar things in Individualism, True and False, right? There might be some more like outside of the Austrian school and like that was really heavily influenced by, this interpretive sociology way of looking at the relationship between social wholes and individuals. It seems like they are methodological individualists in a substantive way, but that methodological individualism is a separate question from some substantive ontological individualism. And like even Marx in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, like has this moment where he takes Hegel to task for not realizing that states are made up of individuals and it's the individual that matters when we think about the state. And he almost sounds like Murray Rothbard could have written that section, right? And so like it seems like the question of methodological individualism as a social scientific matter is a different question from this ontological question of whether individualism or social wholes are real in some deep sense. And I think once we become more thoroughly nominalist, as you seem to want to do, think of ontology with like a level of meta-ontological deflationism like Amy Thomason defends in her Ontology Made Easy work. Like it seems like the ontological questions kind of fall to the background and begin to look like, an empty master-slave dialectic or metaphysical confusion that people have had. And the real questions are to what extent we should be normative individualists and even like, I think the methodological question of social science begins to look a little less like a deep paradigm divide between like conflict theorists and rational choice or individualist theorists, right? So like, what are your thoughts on kind of outgrowing, like Gus de Zerga has this paper working with Hayek arguing that we should outgrow methodological individualism in a certain way. What do you think of like this tension between like the way people like, especially McPherson, and it seems like at times you understand methodological and ontological individualism and like some of the things that I think it's not quite as clear cut as that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Really a series of questions because there's a lot packed in there, right?
Right.
And I should point out that I've accepted that that's one of the weaknesses of the book that I think will be hopefully clarified when I unpack my own approach to the principle of methodological collectivism and normative individualism, right? So, for instance, Kevin Valier wrote, by and large, quite a sympathetic review of the book, which I really appreciated, where he pointed out that there was some ambiguity around this principle. What I point out is that in a footnote in the book, I indicate that this isn't a kind of point that was made originally by me, right? It's actually by the great Marxist scholar Tony Smith in his Beyond Liberal Egalitarianism, where he characterizes liberal egalitarianism as breaking with the conceits of classical liberalism in his commitment to methodological collectivism and normative individualism, as opposed to what he takes to be the classical liberals' commitment to normative and methodological individualism, right? So it's complicated, and it really depends on the thinkers. I think I'll start in the present and work my way back. I actually agree with you that I don't think it is correct to characterize Austrian economists, or what we might call broadly neoliberalism, as committed to a kind of methodological individualism. I think that Hayek makes it very clear in the Constitution of Liberty that individualism is the purview of anarchism, not liberalism, right? That liberals have always appreciated the importance of things like the spontaneous organization of various different social relations and how people are embedded in those, and that they should, to a certain extent, defer to the wisdom that is present within those kind of social practices and those social institutions, right? And I think that, von Mises holds to some pretty similar views on this. I think if you're going to be critical of figures like Hayek or von Mises, it needs to come from another direction. So, for instance, I'd be extremely critical, as, for instance, Hayek and Milton Friedman were, of von Mises' a priorism, right, and that approach to economics, because I just think. And I would also add that I think that this is one of the weaknesses of von Mises' critique of socialism, for example, in his big book, Socialism, right?
In economic and sociological, yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, he makes some good points about statist forms of socialism that I think are pretty well taken, right? When you think about things like the importance of price mechanisms, but he's more or less very dismissive of the idea that there could be non-statist or non-command economic forms of socialism, because he sees that socialism is just definitionally committed to state ownership of the means of production. And again, that's a very kind of a priorist approach, because any historian would say that's just not true, right? There are plenty of socialists, as you know, who are very critical of state management of the economy, who even regarded that as a kind of state capitalism or whatever it happens to be, right? So on the point of the liberal tradition as a whole, I think that one can safely characterize many of the classical liberals, particularly people like Jeremy Bentham, for example, as committed to a kind of methodological and normative individualism, right? And this is very much what, for instance, C.B. Macpherson is trying to criticize, right? This idea that society is to be understood first and foremost as an aggregate of the individuals that make it up. These individuals form, if you want, the real atoms that make up society. And normatively, the best thing to do is to try to pursue one's individual self-interest without regard to anyone else, if at all possible, right? In the book, I point out that the tipping point in the liberal tradition is in the writings of John Stuart Mill, one of his less known works on the nature of logical analysis, right? In the conclusion to his book on logic, Mill actually is somewhat critical of some of these Benthamite kind of intuitions about the nature of social laws, where he says, look, ultimately social law obtains a kind of independent character relative to the psychologies and desires of the individuals that make up society. Nonetheless, Mill says, still, we need to explain social law in terms of those individual psychologies, or individual psychology first and foremost, right? Because it's kind of derivative or emerges from that. So you see Mill starting to wrestle with the question of how far we can be methodological individualists or collectivists in this writing. And I think as the liberal tradition evolves in a further direction, more and more liberals start to take up this idea that we should be methodological collectivists and take it seriously, including many of the Austrian economists who you mentioned, although they will unpack their commitments to normative individualism in a very different way than, of course, liberal socialists would.
Yeah, or even then more deontological libertarians would, for that matter.
Exactly, right. Now, in terms of the kind of ontological and methodological or explanatory question, there I do think things get a little bit blurred in my book, right? And I should be criticized for that. Rightly so, right? I think that what I was emphasizing is that one appreciates the ontological embeddedness of human beings in society. One would reach the methodological conclusion that trying to explain society and social institutions in terms of things like individual psychology, let alone individual desire, is just not going to work, right? Since we're profoundly influenced by the world around us. In fact, in many ways, we're, of course, the product of the world around us, right? But I think the point was explained in an ambiguous way in the book, and I hope to do better in the future in unpacking this.
That's good. There's a related question about like your understanding of normative individualism, especially as the Lockean tradition, which is very heavily influenced by McPherson. Sure. And like, okay, we agree. We've already like settled. Like, we kind of agree that McPherson might have misread Locke in particular as a matter of history, so we don't have to go on that. But it's still. In this conversation, I feel like more so than in the book and other conversations I've heard you have around, I still have this concern that like a lot of liberal socialists, maybe you included, maybe not, have a lack of respect or a lack of appreciation for the ways that something like a Lockean moral commitment to something like property rights is like a key part of any liberalism worth defending. Like, to be clear, the way people like Mises, you like consistently return to this line Mises has in liberalism in the classical tradition, where he says the liberal view can be summed up as a commitment to private property.
Yes,
I think like the way he understood private property was like not historically contingent enough. He oftentimes confused like collective ownership of certain things which can exist, in the absence of a state. Like that's what Eleanor Ostrom's entire work is about, right? How to govern the commons in various ways with state control of the means of production in various ways. And I think Mises didn't appreciate the extent to which like property as it exists under capitalism as a historical matter was largely a creature of state attempts at grabbing power. Like Kevin Carson makes that argument really well in his studies in mutualist political economy. He doesn't appreciate like how intellectual property is very often an artificial creation of the state that doesn't necessarily follow from, a liberal commitment to individualism. He doesn't seem to recognize how the corporate form as it exists in like joint stock corporations was like originally a creature of the state's need to make economic activity in the global marketplace legible for the purposes of tax collection and regulatory stuff. He doesn't seem to appreciate that it was also created largely so extractive rent seekers in the state could extract wealth from their colonial pursuits abroad. Think of like the Dutch and British East India companies as examples of that. So like I can agree, like there's a vulgar libertarianism that does have this possessive individualist quality to it that is problematic. But like there's still all sorts of people in the Lockean tradition, whether it's people like Daniel Lehman point out too, like Hodgkins and Spooner and Bray, who Bray in particular takes it in a socialist direction. And then like all the Ricardian socialists who I think might have a better claim to be called the first liberal socialist than maybe Mill even in a certain way. I would say the same thing about like Hodgkins, he wrote an entire book called Natural and Artificial Property Rights Contrasted, where he just takes defenders of capitalism of his time to task for not recognizing that that property rights as they were evolving in the early 19th century when he was writing just have nothing to do with like a Lockean conception of natural property rights, right? And he like writes with this acidic derision that at times would make Thomas Paine blush, right? Like in making those points. And like it seems to me like, even people in the contemporary libertarian tradition who are not as vulgar, people like people who have been on this podcast, Roderick Long or Jason Lee Bias, or even more statist, minarchist libertarians like Lauren Lomasky, who defend this notion of property as a morally less purely consequentialist version of property as having respect for other people's life projects, right? I think there's a lot to that. I don't necessarily agree with the specific ways any of those thinkers unpack it. And like I have my own project that I presented at the APA a couple of years ago where I'm trying to like metaphysically ground this Lockean intuition about labor, about labor mixing theory of entitlement and something like extended cognition. But I'll put a pin in that because that's my own hobby horse. But it seems to me like many in the liberal socialist tradition don't acknowledge the extent to which the demands that we as embedded creatures must make up on each other to respect the physical manifestations of our life projects is a morally important point. And I would also take like people like David Hume or Hayek to task for doing the same, for being the same way, and they're being way too consequentialist. And like, sure, there's a lot of room for social contestation between collective and social ownership of property. Sure, there's a lot of contestation about like workplace democracy within how we can talk about property rights, and a lot of very complicated stuff about how long you abandon a property before it's said to be collectively owned. You know, a lot of stuff here to unpack. And I think libertarians in particular have been bad about unpacking it. But I don't think that in their badness in unpacking it has caused them to become possessive individualists in certain ways. But I don't think the fact that they've been bad about it means that that project is entirely dead, right?
No, I think that you're absolutely right. And it's not completely dead, right? And I want to point out that I have more respect now for many of the things that you said than I would have even 5 years ago, largely because, I'm friends and I've been influenced by a large number of left libertarians. Again, some of the ones I mentioned, like Levy and Tomasi and Zwolinski and Powell, right, who have really stressed this point to me. And I think it's a valid one, right? So I'm going to start from kind of back in the early classical liberal tradition and his approach to property, and then I'll move on to some of the more contemporary questions that you asked. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's good.
So in terms of this kind of Lockean approach to property, my main animus against it is the propensity to regard property as some kind of natural institution, right?
Right.
Preceding the state or preceding society. And I think it's very difficult to read Locke in any other way, right? He's pretty clear that property rights exist in the state of nature. Indeed, that civil society is created precisely in order to provide protection for our natural rights, including our right to property, right? And I think that as nice as this narrative sounds, it's just completely implausible, right? And I point out that I think Paine was amongst the first to recognize this, right? It's very difficult to understand property except as a social institution, since property, amongst other things, is inherently exclusionary, right? It requires some other that I'm excluding from use of what's mine in order to even make sense. And it's also very difficult, of course, therefore, to separate property from a commitment to various forms of coercion, right? Particularly things like state coercion in order to preserve private property entitlements by ensuring that other people are excluded from the use of your property. And the reason I continuously foreground this is one of the more useless debates I think that's emerged between libertarians and socialists is over this question of state coercion or non-state coercion, right? I still see many vulgar libertarians, to use your terminology, say things like, well, socialists just want a coercive state. And then when I inevitably bring up, well, if you think property rights should be respected, doesn't that require state coercion in order to back it up? They'll say, yeah, but that's justified state coercion. And my response then is, well, okay, but then we're not talking about coercion versus non-coercion. Right. What we're talking about is what forms of coercion are justified. And maybe it is the case that a more propertarian approach is justified and a liberal socialist one isn't, but then we need to have that debate and not get sidetracked in idle debates about which among us are supporting coercion or not, right? And I do think that it has been more difficult for libertarians and certainly classical liberals to kind of wean themselves off of this idea that property is a natural institution or a natural right than many have appreciated, right? Although, as you point out, the modern libertarian tradition has taken this a lot more seriously and is much more sophisticated. Just to give one quick example, right? Robert Nozick, right? Robert Nozick is extremely critical of this idea that labor mixing is some kind of basis of property entitlements, right?
And rightly so, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, right. He makes fun of it by, with that famous metaphor of, if I mix my tomato juice with the ocean, do I suddenly come to own the Mediterranean Sea, right? If only, right? But he doesn't really have a very good alternative explanation for where property comes than this kind of a very Lockean sounding story, right? So ultimately, what I think that we need to do as a society and as thinkers is recognize that property is a social institution, that state or some kind of coercion is required in order to instantiate respect for it, and then ask ourselves, are the forms of justification given for this coercion legitimate and plausible, or are they not? And that opens up a more granular set of questions than what you get in these more reductive forms of the Lockean story that again still pervade a lot of vulgar libertarianism and vulgar classical liberalism, right? Now, in terms of my own response to this, right? Again, I think that property does serve a useful function on some circumstances, and I'd like to stress that all liberal socialists would agree with that, right? So again, every liberal socialist, for example, would emphasize the importance of things like personal property for the reasons that you mentioned, right? An acknowledgement of the fact that personal property is important for people's self-respect and the sense of self-ownership that's intrinsic to anyone who supports the liberal tradition. And also because various forms of property can also have an expressive kind of value, right? If I own a book, then that can be seen as an expression of me, and having someone take that away from me can be very damaging.
That's very much the intuition I'm pumping in my extended cognition and property rights work.
Yeah, exactly, right. So figures like John Stuart Mill and Rawls and Bourdieu, right, are sensitive to this, right? The question becomes, when does private property reach a threshold where ownership of the means of production or ownership of the commanding heights of the economy facilitates domination of individuals by other individuals, right? And where that threshold lies is extremely debatable, even in the liberal socialist tradition, right? So I'll tell kind of a Nozick type story that helps make sense of this, right? Nozick is famous for his kind of Wilt Chamberlain thought experiment that I think captures some of these issues, right? Where, he famously says, look, people just drop quarters into Wilt Chamberlain's box because they want to see him play basketball. Has he wronged anyone because of his collection of those quarters? Shouldn't he be allowed to keep the fruits of his labor because people willingly transferred their wealth to him in exchange for a service, right? And most liberal socialists would be fairly sympathetic to this, right? I don't think you're going to really see Rawls or Mill saying that we need to take everything that Wilt has earned in order to give it to someone else, right? The problem comes if Wilt Chamberlain decides to retire from basketball, take the money that he's earned to buy a factory, hires workers to work at that factory who then want to exercise their right to freedom of assembly to unionize, and then Wilt goes to the town manager and says, look, I made a major campaign donation to you for my basketball earnings when I bought this factory, and I now expect you to pass ordinances that are going to make it more difficult for my workers to unionize because times are tough right now. And I don't want them to do that, right? In these circumstances, which are far more realistic than what you get in the Wilt Chamberlain thought experiment, right? We see Wilt exercising his ownership of the means of production and the political capital that he has thereby accrued in order to impede other people's freedom. In this case, the freedom of his workers to exercise their right to freedom of assembly in order to unionize, right? And ultimately, when we've passed the threshold between these more kind of Eden-esque Wilt Chamberlain stories, and the later one, or the sequel that I gave, is qualitative, historical, and contextual, right? I don't think there's ever going to be a clear a priori answer that you can give. But I do think that there are good arguments for social ownership or democratic ownership of the means of production, even if I respect the necessity or the importance of things like personal property in many circumstances.
Yeah, I would agree. So this question of the naturalness of property that you started with, I think there's three questions that get run together. One is like a meta-ethical question as to whether property is like written into the very fabric of nature in this very deep sense, like when Locke talks about God imbuing us with rights to property, right? There are people who I know who would accept that. But I think I myself am like meta-ethically some sort of quasi-realist or constitutivist.
Sure.
So like I'm not, the question of whether property is like a mind-independent moral fact or something like that is I think, I would say no to that, but we can still have a degree of like normative respect for property. The second is the social scientific question as to whether property precedes the existence of something like a state, right? And that you seem to think, correct me if I'm wrong, like it's very, very unlikely that it is. And I would push back on that because like there's a lot of work by thinkers like Bruce Benson in his Enterprise of Law, David Friedman, Milton's son, in his recent book, Legal Systems Very Different from Our Own, and like some of the stuff he did in his original Machinery of Freedom book. People like Ed Stringham, Pete Leeson, a lot of the people in like what Peter Becky calls the analytical anarchist wing of like social thought that does seem to say some sort of property does pre-exist like a state divining it from on high. Like does seem like once you get outside of the savannah and into something resembling a more complicated society, something like a respect for other people's projects emerge, and there's all sorts of ways in which that was historically unjust in non-state and pre-state societies, all sorts of like really complicated questions that happen once that socially emerges in a way. But it doesn't seem to me like people like Hart who press this, well, property rights are just, you only have property rights because of the existence of the state, therefore the state can redraw property rights in any way it likes with no moral constraint. Like they're not appreciating the extent to which, no, things like property rights, both collective property rights and individual property rights. Collective, I would point to people like Lynn Ostrom's work on governing the commons. Individual, I'd point to people like Bruce Spence and David Friedman and their work on or Pete Leeson and their work on analytical anarchism. It seems to me like it's very, very plausible to think something like, exclusive ownership, rights of exclusion to certain material things does pre-exist the state. Right. And then there's a third question, which is whether we should normatively respect, these claims to property, regardless of whatever the contingent history is, as a matter of like first order normative argument. And like those are three questions that I worry you sometimes run together in your work. And it seems like I think you and I would agree the answer to the first question is no, and then maybe disagree on the other two, or you might agree with some version of the third of yes to the normative question. But heavily qualified in a way that I wouldn't. And then we would probably disagree on the second. But it just seems to me like the question as to whether it's like natural in this very deep sense that like Leo Strauss would talk about natural rights is like a very different question from the things that like contemporary libertarians ask, and even some of the radical Lockeans of the 19th century would have thought about it, like Thomas Hodgkins.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do agree that these questions are sometimes run together in the book. Although I want to point out that, again, the book is not intended as a kind of espousal of my own political theoretical views, right? They're kind of an espousal of everyone else's views. And part of the reason for this was kind of finding a way to situate myself in a political theoretical tradition, right? So in my own elaboration of this, my position would be quite different from the one that you see, say, John Stuart Mill or John Rawls take, okay? But just as a kind of quick answer to the three questions you asked, in terms of metaethically, I'm a quasi-cognitive moral realist in the kind of Parfitian sense, right? So I think that moral principles emerge from processes of human cognition, but they retain a kind of independence from our subjectivity in the same way that, say, mathematical relations, right, are very much the products of human cognition. I'm not a Platonist, right? I don't think that there's...
Sorry, I'm unclear with... Maybe you were about to answer this, but I'm not fully familiar with Parfit on this matter. Is that independence understood in, like, ontological ways, like it's a sense of metaphysical independence, or is it understood in a more like epistemic or normative way?
It's a more metaphysical independence, right? Okay. So again, I'm not ontologically committed to the idea that there is a categorical imperative that is separate from processes of human cognition, right? Okay. In the same way that I'm not a Platonist about mathematics, right? I don't think that there's some kind of let's call it vulgar Platonism, right? I don't think there's some kind of heavenly number two out there, right? That all empirical number twos are all number twos that appear on calculators.
Empirical reflections of it.
Yeah, exactly. I just think that that's an implausible view, although, it has its appeal and still has its defenders, right? And in the same way, I think that moral principles emerge from processes of human cognition and human reasoning, right? But rather like mathematics or the rules of logic, right? They obtain, again, this kind of independence from our subjectivity, such that we can't just arbitrarily remake moral principles to be whatever it is that we want at any given time, right? So, a Nazi philosopher who said we're going to reinvent morality to mean that the categorical imperative should be rethought as do whatever Adolf Hitler would tell you to do or want you to do at any given time. That would be illegitimate, right? So we don't need to dive too much into those meta-ethical questions. On terms of the social scientific issue, there I think that there's a lot of mixed evidence about this. I absolutely agree that what we might call personal possession or this desire or aspiration for personal possession is a persistent feature of many human societies, right? In the same way that I would stress that the nationalists have a point when they point out that tribalism seems to be a characteristic feature of many forms of human social organization, right? Which can lean into an argument for why it is that nationalism kind of gels with who we are. But at the same time, there's anthropological evidence that suggests that many early human societies were also cooperative and shared things in common, much like there's arguments that human beings were originally polyamorous, right? So there's an enormous amount of debates about this. And frankly, I just always find it problematic whenever we try to argue from state of nature scenarios, right? By saying, well, originally we were like this, so we should continue to be like this.
Right.
Or that provides normative argument.
That sounds like a naturalistic fallacy to me when people do that. Yeah.
Exactly. Formally, it's a naturalistic fallacy, but also just even more colloquially, I find that everyone is always just able to find evidence to support their prior views, right? If you're a socialist, you say, well, look at how much anthropological evidence there is to suggest that people are primitive communists prior to the organization of the state, right? If you're a capitalist, you'll say things like, look at the anthropological evidence for the importance of things like competitiveness and personal possession. I see a lot of Hazoni-type nationalists who will say all human beings seem to be tribalistic from the very beginning, which means that nationalism is intrinsic to human nature. What I think is ultimately the more interesting question is the last one, the one that you mentioned, right?
The normative
about the normative arguments for private property, right? There I think things get very complicated, as you mentioned, right? Because there's an enormous debate about this, right? And I should add, there are some socialists, like say G.A. Cohen, right? Who are even sympathetic to some left Lockean, even left Nozikian arguments about the nature of property, right? Since, they'll say, look, Locke's proviso is that, you need to leave as good or more whenever you create property, right? And also there's this claim that labor should be the basis of property entitlements, which obviously means the workers are exploited, right? You mentioned Ricardian socialism as an exemplary tradition in that respect, right? So we don't have time to mince all that again.
Right.
Ultimately, as a normative Rawlsian, right, I think that there's no knockdown argument that you can make against the importance of things like private or personal property, right? Because I don't think it's unjust prima facie. I think that arguments for private property or private ownership of the means of production have to turn on to what extent private ownership of the means of production or private property services the interests of the least well-off. Put it really simply, right? And by that metric, I just don't think that our contemporary societies are doing a very good job because we've made such a fetish of property and private ownership as a means of production that our societies are no longer fulfilling the obligations and responsibilities that they have towards the least well-off. In terms of how I would cash out these kinds of Rawlsian intuitions, I've been very overt about appealing or pointing to the Nordic states or the Scandinavian variant of socialism, as the historian Sejersted puts it, as the kind of model that I'd want to build on. And there, what we see are inherently a very pluralistic set of approaches to property, right? I don't necessarily have a problem with, say, businesses if they are, after a certain scale, run cooperatively, right? I also don't have a problem with people earning a little bit more than others, so long as they are taxed to finance things like a welfare state. I even don't have a problem with some larger scale industries if they could organize by something like, say, the Meidner Plan, right? Which would ultimately make trade unions the major shareholders in certain larger scale industries that might be important in order to sustain things like autonomies of scale, right? I really endorse this kind of experimentalist approach to socialism, which I think is key to the Mayorist quality of liberal socialism at a theoretical level, right? And I think that Scandinavian version of socialism or Nordic socialism best emulate or best instantiate that in the real world thus far, even if I would be on the left end of the political spectrum in those countries.
Right, okay, so your illusion of the Nordic model gets at another criticism that I think I have, and you at times share, of the liberal socialist tradition, which is that it seems like there's a lack of engagement in empirical comparative institutional analysis at times. Like, I know you're well aware of like the criticisms people have, like Chris Raymond has made of the idea that the Nordic models are socialist in this way because they still retain markets. They even still have like no minimum wage.
Chris and I actually are working on a project together. He's contributed an essay to my Cohen collection. He's a nice guy, right?
Yeah.
I disagree with him about a lot, but he's a really good faith and
I saw that. Yeah, he was the first. He was at the first IHS seminar I went to, so I've known him for a while. Anyway, you're familiar with all those criticisms that the Nordic model might actually be more market friendly than people like Bernie think, right?
Sure.
But another thing is that I think people don't emphasize the ways in which like the Nordic countries are also really illiberal, right? And illiberal in interesting ways that seem to make us ask penetrating questions about whether the institutions of a state-based welfare state that liberal socialists hold dear is really the best way to meet the demands of distributive or relational egalitarianism, right? Because like it seems like what happens when you make a state, like David Beto's work on how in many ways the creation of the welfare state in the United States started to crowd out these other more stigmergic institutions of civil society, your charities, your religious orders, your fraternal societies, so on, all the mutual aid stuff. And then once you do that, then people start to semiotically interpret the welfare state as this like nexus of the meaning for our solidaristic desires, right? Mm-hmm. And once you do that, there's this tendency for people to want to use nationalism to exclude people they don't like from their welfare state, right? And like there's a recent whole book called Racism in and for the Welfare State, which is this collection of Marxist scholars where they're pointing out, and there's an entire book in there on Sweden, which is pointing out the ways in which like welfare state enables and has this complicated relationship with racist and nationalist views, right? And so like I worry that when you start pointing to the Nordic model is this more idealized version of the welfare state, it's like still too statist in certain ways, and obviously none of that means as a knockdown argument for we should abolish the welfare state immediately or anything like that. More an argument for in the long arc of the next 200 years, we should wean ourselves off of the welfare state in some way. But I worry that like not appreciating the extent to which the Nordic countries are still illiberal, even left parties in those countries are cracking, especially like Denmark, are cracking down on immigration in recent years in a really illiberal way that I don't think you would endorse. And they're doing it explicitly because of that dynamic that I think evolves, which is once people imbue like meaning to the welfare state, they want to be exclusionary. This is also why I think that like defenses of nationalism like Gil Tamir's that are supposed to be the civic liberal nationalism to foster a desire for the state to provide public goods like social insurance are really, really wanting, because that I do think liberal nationalism is an oxymoron, for example, and I suspect you might agree with me in some respect on that.
I think it would be conceptually very difficult to square those two things together. Historically is a very different question.
Right. Well, I think historically also like it's been this constant like master-slave dialectic between the two. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so what are your thoughts on like some of the comparative institutional analysis questions about the actual implementations of this that I have?
Well, I think I'm going to break this question up into two. I'm going to talk about the race and nationalism bit, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the solidaristic dimension. Is that okay? I mean, I understand that the two are integrated together. I just think that it might help to analytically break those down. Look, I completely agree with you that there are intrinsic difficulties that have appeared in these countries in terms of the national and even Volkish way in which a commitment to Nordic social democracy has been understood, right? Oftentimes, for instance, these were defended as the people's home, and this was defended on a very transparently Volkish way. And, Sweden was not an ally of the Nazis in the Second World War. In fact, many of the Swedish Social Democrats were quite hostile to Nazism, but they nonetheless continued to trade with them and to a certain extent offer them certain kinds of transportation routes so they could move troops to Russia, et cetera, right? And so that's something that you could be critical of. The rebuttal I would make to those who charge Nordic socialism, or the Scandinavian variant of socialism, with being intrinsically Volkish, is that just doesn't seem to be true to me, right? Any more than it's true that liberalism or neoliberalism inherently needs to be a kind of racial liberalism or racist liberalism. What we've seen historically is that it has proven, unfortunately, very, very easy to combine racist and nationalist sentiments with an enormous array of different kind of viewpoints, right? Just to give one example that's pretty contemporary, in his book Hayek's Bastards, Quinn Slobodian has recently pointed out how there's a reason why people now talk about the libertarian or neoliberal to MAGA or alt-right pipeline. It might seem that
I have a lot of thoughts on that book, by the way.
Yeah, sure, right? But I mean, look, I have thoughts about the consistency of those viewpoints as well. But what he points out is, it's not a coincidence that people like Murray Rothbard later on had sympathetic things to say about the KKK, right? Or for that matter, while Ludwig von Mises used to say these extraordinarily derogatory things about Black people and used to say that there are good arguments for restricting immigration from the third world because we can't necessarily integrate these figures. Because a lot of neoliberals and right-wing or paleo-libertarians were deeply concerned about the rise of the welfare state, and they were concerned that non-whites would necessarily become dependent on the state. If they're given the right to vote, they would vote for further welfarism. And so they adopted racist ideas on that basis, or they were attracted to racist ideas on that basis. And this has continued down to the present day, right? Some of your followers might know that I spent a lot of my time writing about the contemporary right. Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, Peter Thiel's kind of pet philosopher.
Yeah, he used to be a libertarian at one point, right?
Yeah, he self-described as a libertarian, deeply influenced by von Mises and Rothbard. Also said that he's like Hitler if Hitler lost 25 IQ points, and that's a direct quote, right? And these are exactly the kind of arguments he gives, right? That, look, libertarianism is not opposed to a commitment to law and order. It's not opposed to a commitment to a kind of homogeneity, because all of these things are necessary prerequisites to respect property and to respect individual rights. And if we need an authoritarian government to do so, as long as it respects property rights and it respects a certain kind of individual autonomy, that's A-OK, right? So whenever people try to charge Scandinavian variant of socialism or Nordic socialism with being inherently Volkish, I say, look, the sad reality is these ideas can be attractive across the political spectrum, even in doctrines that you think would be inoculated against that, like libertarianism or neoliberalism. And I think it's to the credit of the libertarian movement that people like Solinsky and Tomasi have been very critical of paleo-libertarianism or the libertarian to MAGA pipeline. Or Sheikha, the editor of Unpopulous, is another good example, right? Because I think that reckoning has been long overdue, right?
Yeah.
So that'd be my response there, right? I don't think that, I think that if libertarianism doesn't have to be invariably tarnished because of the association of some libertarians and neoliberals with extremely toxic racist ideas, that I don't think we can tarnish Nordic socialism or the Scandinavian variant of socialism because some proponents of those viewpoints also endorsed racist and bigoted views, right? And I'd say the same about in Canada, for example, right? Tommy Douglas is one of the founders of the Canadian public health system, was voted to be the greatest Canadian. He also endorsed a kind of racial dysgenics that I have nothing but contempt for. Right. So there's that question. On the solidaristic question, I think that's a very interesting one. So there's a very interesting book recently written by historian Osberg called The Rise and Fall of Swedish Social Democracy, where he points out that actually one of the appeals of Swedish socialism or Swedish social democracy was precisely that it induced this kind of solidaristic atmosphere through statist and non-statist mechanisms, right? Some of which did supplant older civil society organizations. But he, by and large, thinks that this was a price worth paying, and I do as well, because the problem is that by offshoring our obligations to other people, to voluntary civil society organizations, it's very often the case that those obligations aren't carried out in any particularly robust way, right? And we've seen that time and time again in countries like, say, the United States, right? I see Republicans 1,000 times a day saying, the poor can be taken care of by charity, right? We have charity in the United States, and it's never risen to anywhere near the threshold that would be required to provision the poor with things like basic health care, right? You can have as many GoFundMes as you want. That nothing is going to be a substitute for instituting something like a public healthcare system. So I think that, to use Osberg's terminology, the propensity of the Nordic model to establish solidarity by investing the well-being of everyone and the well-being of everyone else is a strength, not a defect, even if, of course, there's trade-offs that come from that, right? And one of the other virtues of the Nordic approach that I would put forward, that's actually in contrast to the kind of Volkish examples that you gave before, is sometimes I see conservatives argue, Nordic social democracy or Nordic socialism can only work in those countries because they're white and they're homogenous, right? By and large, the people are very unified, so they're willing to cooperate with one another to
Yeah,
provision these kinds of goods. That can never happen.
that's overstated if you look at the levels of foreign born people in those states.
That's exactly right. But I
Yeah.
would also point out that if you read a good history of Nordic social democracy, and I'd recommend Seiersted's is probably the best available in English right now. One of the things that they point out is that actually prior to the introduction of social democracy or Nordic socialism, these were extremely ununified countries, right? Sweden in particular was riven by enormous amounts of class conflict. These are extremely inequitable countries that were facing revolution in some circumstances or underwent it. If you look at Finland, right? There were wars that broke out between Sweden and Norway. And in many cases, it was actually the introduction of this model that brought about the unity for which they are now claimed, right? All social scientific phenomena are multi-causal, but I think that this argument that you see conservatives make, which is that the Volkish unity came first and then social democracy came afterwards, does by and large get the causality inverted, right? It's actually the social democracy that came first, and then the sense of unity that came afterwards, right? So I would argue that in a complicated country that's torn up now, like the United States, the introduction of something like the Nordic version of socialism could be just what we need in order to help induce a greater sense of unity and to ameliorate a lot of the intense forms of partisanship that we see right now, because historically that's what happened in a lot of those states, right? Although, of course, that's purely speculative on my part. We're not going to know unless Bernie Sanders or AOC, probably AOC, becomes president, gets a few terms under her belt and then, is able to implement her agenda. And then we can see whether my experiment turns out to be true.
Yeah, I suppose my worry, and we're wanting for time, so we should probably continue this conversation outside of this podcast,
Sure.
is that once you sort of like make those solidaristic expansions of your like sphere of justice into a national ideology that is committed to the state, it risks ossifying and reifying itself in a way that like undermines the commitment to global justice that I think liberals should have.
I think so too. And I mean, this is one of the things that I'm critical of in my book, right? That liberal socialists, by and large, tend to have too statist an approach to justice. Although to push back somewhat, I would say that Pelle Dragstedt, in his book Nordic Socialism, which is mainly about the Danish experiments, points out again that the experience of Nordic socialism in Denmark was inherently pluralistic and in many cases anti-statist. So he points out that in the 19th century, there were already, I think he said, about 1,000 cooperatives that existed in Denmark, which is an unfathomable number when you think about the small size of the country, right? And in many of these co-ops, you saw people espouse socialist ideals, while at the same time being quite wary of statist control of the economy, right? So the idea was that workers should run these businesses for themselves, or the towns should run these businesses for themselves, right? So I don't think that there's anything in the Nordic model that precludes private or civil society organizations or even small-scale businesses, right, that aren't beholden to the state. Again, I think that the pluralism that's intrinsic to experimentalism that's intrinsic to Nordic socialism is one of its strengths, not a weakness.
Okay, one last very quick question that I always ask on the podcast. What are 3 books, works of art, interpretive dances, whatever, that have been influential over you that you think the audience should read to better understand the tradition of liberal socialism?
Oh, wow. Okay. Okay, 3 books. 2 of which people will expect, maybe the last one they won't expect. I'm a Rawlsian Marxist, right? So I would really strongly recommend reading, let's go for something different. John Rawls' History of Political Philosophy, particularly the 3 chapters on Marx, where he characterizes Marx as a heroic figure, sketches out Rawls' own vision for liberal socialism, and talks about what he thinks liberals should learn from Marx, and also where liberals should be critical of Marx, right? I think that those are very, very important if you want to understand the tradition I'm talking about. I'd also strongly recommend reading Karl Marx's works. In particular, I think that the Grundrisse is his most creative, innovative, and imaginative work. It's tough going in parts, right? But if you want a sense of Marx's ingenuity as an interdisciplinary thinker, there's no better place to start than that. And I think a lot of what he wrote in that text about his methodology and about the potential era of intellectual labor taking over manual labor, right? The kind of triumph of the general intellect was very far-sighted and has rightly gained a little bit more attention, well, actually quite a lot more attention in recent years. And then I guess the last book that I'd recommend for people is I kind of came out of a more continental tradition. I was late to analytical philosophy, as it were. My supervisor was the one who really pushed me to that. But I never lost my fondness for some aspects of continental philosophy. And I think that Wendy Brown, the great American political theorist, right now, and her trilogy on neoliberalism is extremely thoughtful, even if we should be critical of some aspects of it. In particularly, the central book, Walled States, Waning Sovereignty, where in the 2010s she predicted that right-wing populists were going to gain ascendancy and try to build walls on national borders. Especially, she predicts that this is going to happen in America along the southern border. They really look very far-sighted right now. So I'd recommend that people take a look at them. For anyone who's looking for a kind of Sheldon Wolin-esque approach to political theory, Wendy Brown is your thinker.
All right, McManus, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure and a great discussion. Yeah, really wide-ranging.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Mutual Exchange Radio. And thank you again to Matt for coming on the show to discuss his book. If you are interested in supporting projects like this and others that we do at C4SS, you can support us at patreon.com/c4ss.org. That's patreon.com/C4SSDOTORG. A special thank you to our current Patreon supporting the show. David Colburn, Makila Maki, Dunkel Zahn, Brady P, and ASDFA.